There is a silence that does not feel like peace. It feels like absence. It is the silence that settles over a life that has slowly, almost imperceptibly stopped talking to God. Not all at once, not in a single dramatic moment of rebellion or rejection, but gradually the way a fire dies when no one tends it, not with a sudden extinguishing, but with a slow cooling, an ember at a time, until one day you reach toward the place where the warmth used to be and find only ash. You do not remember the exact day you stopped praying. There was no decision, no announcement, no line you consciously crossed. There was only a Tuesday that became a week, that became a month, and somewhere in the accumulation of ordinary days, the conversation that once anchored your soul simply faded into the background noise of a life that got busier and louder and more demanding, until the quiet place where you used to meet God went unvisited so long that you began to wonder whether anyone had ever been there at all. If you have felt that, if some part of you recognizes that description with an ache you cannot quite name, then you already understand, at a level deeper than words, exactly what this study is about. We are going to talk today about something that almost no one talks about honestly. We are going to talk about what actually happens to the human soul when prayer stops. Not what happens to your schedule, not what happens to your church attendance, not the external, visible, easily measured things. We are going to talk about the interior reality, the slow, quiet, often invisible erosion that takes place in the deep places of a person when the lifeline of prayer is cut, and the equally real, equally quiet restoration that becomes possible the moment that lifeline is taken up again. Because here is the truth that nobody tells you. The consequences of a prayerless life are rarely loud. They do not arrive as thunderclaps. They arrive as a thinning, a flattening, a gradual loss of color and depth and weight in a life that, from the outside, may look entirely unchanged. You can keep functioning. You can keep working and talking and planning and smiling. And all the while, something essential is quietly going hungry, starving in a room you have stopped entering. This is not a study designed to make you feel guilty. Let me say that as clearly and as warmly as I possibly can right at the beginning, so that you can lower your defenses and receive what follows with an open heart. Guilt is not the point. Guilt has never once, in all of human history, produced a genuine return to God. Guilt produces hiding. It produces the very avoidance that deepened the problem in the first place. No, this is not a study about guilt. This is a study about love. It is a study about a God who has not moved, has not left, has not grown cold or distant or disappointed in the time since you last spoke to him. It is a study about what he has been doing in the silence, and what he is still offering, and how near he still is, and how completely the whole situation can change the moment you turn back toward the voice that has never stopped calling your name. So before we go any further, before we open a single passage of Scripture or examine a single truth, let us simply take a breath together. Wherever you are right now, whatever room you're sitting in, whatever has been happening in your life in the days and weeks and months and perhaps years leading up to this moment, you are welcome here. This is a space where you do not have to perform. You do not have to pretend that your prayer life is healthier than it is. You do not have to project a version of yourself that is closer to God than you actually feel. You can come exactly as you are, dry, distant, distracted, disillusioned. Whatever the true condition of your soul is in this moment, you can bring it here without disguise. Because the God we are going to talk about is the kind of God who has always preferred the honest prayer of a struggling heart to the polished performance of a confident one. Let us begin. Before we open the first passage of Scripture, I want to pause and do something that matters to me very much, and that is to acknowledge you, the specific person watching this right now, because you are not an abstract viewer or a statistic or a number on a screen. You are a real human being who chose, out of all the things you could be doing with this portion of your time, to be here with this, seeking something. And that means something to me. I do not take it lightly that you are here. I would genuinely love to know where in the world you are watching from. Take just a moment and leave it in the comments below. Your city, your country, or simply a warm greeting to everyone else who is here. Whether you are watching from somewhere in the United States, from a great city or a small, quiet town, from England or Scotland or Ireland or Wales, from Canada or Australia or New Zealand, from somewhere in Africa or Asia or the islands of the Pacific, from South America or the Caribbean or a corner of the world I may never have the chance to visit, let us know. And then watch what happens in those comments. Watch them fill with names of places from every continent and every time zone, and let that be a quiet reminder to you that you are not alone in this. You are not the only one who let prayer slip away. You are not the only one who is here today hoping to find the way back. There are people all over this world right now, sitting exactly where you are sitting, feeling exactly what you are feeling, and they found their way to this same study because they are looking for the same thing you are looking for. And if this channel has ever been a source of encouragement to you, if these studies have fed your faith, or brought comfort to a hard season, or helped you understand the heart of God a little more deeply, I want to ask you something with full sincerity and genuine warmth. Please subscribe. If you have not already done so, take just a moment right now and press that subscribe button. It costs you nothing, not even 30 seconds, but it makes an enormous difference. Every person who subscribes helps this content reach someone else who is sitting in the silence, wondering if there is a way back. And there is. And they need to find it the way you found it today. So please, subscribe and become a permanent part of this community. And if you would like to go a step deeper, I want to warmly invite you to consider becoming a member of this channel. Membership is a way of belonging more fully to this growing family of believers from around the world, people in dozens of nations, separated by oceans and languages and time zones, but gathered together by one name and one love. As a member, you receive early access to our videos before they are released to everyone else, so that you are always among the first to receive what God places on our hearts to create. The link to join is right here, and it would be a genuine honor to have you with us. Now, let us open the Word together and let us begin to discover what really happens to the soul when prayer stops, and the far greater truth of what happens when it begins again. Part 1. What prayer actually is. Why its absence is felt so deeply. Before we can understand what is lost when prayer stops, we have to understand what prayer actually is. And here is where almost everyone goes wrong from the very beginning, because the popular understanding of prayer is so thin, so transactional, so mechanical, that it could never account for why its absence would devastate the soul. If prayer were merely the act of submitting requests to a cosmic authority, a kind of spiritual paperwork, a way of filing your needs with the management of the universe, then its absence would be a matter of administrative inconvenience at most. You would simply stop receiving the things you used to ask for, but that is not what people experience when they stop praying. What they experience is something far deeper and far stranger. A loss of orientation, a fraying of identity, a creeping sense of being unmoored, a hunger they cannot satisfy with anything else. And that experience tells us that prayer was never merely a mechanism for getting things. It was something else entirely. It was the breathing of the soul. Consider the way the scriptures describe the relationship between God and the human being. Genesis tells us that when God formed the first man from the dust of the ground, he breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living soul. Life, at its very origin, was an act of divine breathing, God exhaling himself, in a sense, into the creature he had formed. And from that moment, the human being was designed to live in continuous exchange with the one who had breathed life into him. Not occasional exchange, not emergency exchange. Continuous. The way the lungs were designed for continuous breathing, the soul was designed for continuous communion. Prayer, understood rightly, is not an activity the soul performs. It is the activity by which the soul lives. It is the inhaling and exhaling of the spiritual life. It is the means by which the breath of God, first given at creation, continues to fill and sustain the inner person across all the days of a life. This is why the absence of prayer is felt so deeply, even by people who could not articulate what is wrong. When you stop praying, you do not merely stop a religious habit, you begin slowly to suffocate, not physically. The body goes on, but the soul, deprived of the exchange it was built for, begins to experience the spiritual equivalent of oxygen deprivation. There is a heaviness, a dullness, a diminishing capacity to feel what you used to feel, to perceive what you used to perceive, to hope the way you used to hope. The lights do not go out all at once, they dim. And because they dim so gradually, you adjust to the dimness, you accommodate it, you forget what the full light was even like, until something, perhaps something like this study, reminds you, and you feel a sudden sharp longing for a brightness you had forgotten you were missing. The Apostle Paul, writing to the church at Thessalonica, gave an instruction that has puzzled and challenged believers for 2,000 years. He said simply, "Pray without ceasing." 3 words in the English. And they have provoked endless questions. How can anyone pray without ceasing? We have jobs to do, conversations to have, sleep to get. We cannot spend every waking moment with our eyes closed and our hands folded. But this confusion arises only because we have misunderstood what prayer is. If prayer is a specific posture, a set-aside activity, a discrete event with a beginning and an end, then of course we cannot do it without ceasing. But if prayer is the continuous orientation of the soul toward God, a running, ongoing, conversational openness, an abiding awareness of His presence, a habitual turning of the heart toward the one who is always near, then praying without ceasing is not only possible, it is the natural condition of a soul that is alive. It is the spiritual equivalent of breathing without ceasing. You do not schedule your breaths. You do not set aside specific times to breathe and then hold your breath the rest of the day. You breathe continuously, automatically, because you are alive. And Paul is describing a soul so alive to God that communion with Him becomes as natural and continuous as breath. Now consider what this means for the soul that has stopped praying. It does not merely mean that the soul has skipped some optional spiritual exercise. It means the soul has stopped breathing in the way it was designed to breathe, and a soul that has stopped breathing does not announce its distress with dramatic symptoms. It simply begins, quietly, to die, or more precisely, to grow numb, to lose feeling, to enter a kind of spiritual hypoxia in which it can no longer perceive clearly, can no longer feel deeply, can no longer respond to God or to others with the fullness it was made for. This is the first truth that nobody tells you. When you stop praying, the issue is not that God stops listening. The issue is that you stop breathing. And the suffocation, when it comes, is felt not as a punishment imposed from outside, but as a starvation experienced from within. The Greek word that the New Testament most often uses in connection with prayer is proseuch, and the prefix pros is significant. It means toward, a movement in the direction of something, a turning of the whole self toward a destination. Prayer, in its very grammar, is a turning toward God. And the soul that turns toward God is a soul that is oriented, anchored, facing the source of its life. The soul that stops praying is a soul that has turned away, not necessarily in hostility, often simply in distraction, and a soul turned away from its source begins inevitably to drift. There is no neutral position. There is no standing still in the spiritual life. You are either turning toward God or drifting away from Him, and prayer is the mechanism of the turning. Stop the turning, and the drifting begins. Not because God has set the current against you, but because the nature of a soul cut off from communion is to drift. The way a boat unanchored in a river will be carried downstream by a current it did not choose and cannot resist. We will spend the hours of this study tracing exactly what that drift looks like, naming with as much honesty and precision as we can the specific things that happen to the soul as the prayerless days accumulate. But I want you to hear, even now, before we name a single one of them, that none of this is said to frighten you. It is said to wake you. There is an enormous difference. Fear says, "Look how far you have fallen. Look how much you have lost." Despair of ever recovering it. But waking says, "Look what is happening. Look what is at stake. Look how much there is to recover." And notice that the recovery is fully available, that the door is not locked, that the way back is shorter than you fear, and the welcome at the end of it is warmer than you can imagine. Everything we are about to explore is in the service of waking, never of fear. So let us continue, with our eyes open and our hearts unafraid, into the truth that nobody tells you. Part 2. The first thing to go. The sense of God's nearness. The first thing that begins to fade when prayer stops is not your belief in God. That often remains intact, sometimes for a very long time. You can go years without praying and still affirm, if anyone asks, that you believe God exists, that Jesus is who He said He was, that the gospel is true. Belief is surprisingly durable. It can survive on the fumes of old conviction long after the fuel of living communion has run out. No, the first thing that goes is not belief. The first thing that goes is the sense of God's nearness, the felt presence, the experiential awareness that He is here with you, attending to you close enough to touch. This is a subtle loss, and it is precisely its subtlety that makes it so dangerous. Because the loss of God's felt nearness does not feel at first like a spiritual crisis. It feels like normal life. It feels like maturity, even. You might tell yourself that you have simply outgrown the emotionalism of an earlier faith, that you are now operating on a more sophisticated, less feelings-dependent footing. And there is a half-truth buried in that rationalization, which is what makes it so effective. It is true that the felt presence of God is not the foundation of our relationship with Him, that faith is not the same as feeling, that God is no less present in the dry seasons than in the warm ones. All of that is true, but it is a truth that can be twisted into a justification for spiritual neglect, and that is exactly what the drifting soul tends to do with it. It uses the genuine truth that feelings are not foundational to excuse the genuine loss of a nearness that it was meant to cultivate and enjoy. Let us be honest about what the felt nearness of God actually is, because the church has sometimes been confused about it. It is not the foundation of your salvation. Your salvation rests on the finished work of Christ, not on whether you feel close to God on any given Tuesday. But it is, nonetheless, a real and precious gift, and it is a gift that is largely mediated through prayer. When you spend time in communion with God, speaking to Him, listening for Him, turning your attention toward Him, dwelling in His Word, lingering in His presence, there develops over time a sensitivity, an awareness, a kind of spiritual perception that allows you to recognize His nearness in the ordinary moments of your day. You begin to sense Him in the quiet. You begin to feel His comfort in the difficult hours. You begin to perceive His guidance, His pleasure, His correction, His love, not as dramatic supernatural events, but as a steady undertone running beneath your daily experience. This perception is real, and it is one of the great joys of a praying life. And it is the first thing to fade when prayer stops, because the perception was being cultivated by the communion, and when the communion ceases, the perception begins to dull. It is exactly like a sense that goes unused. A person who lives in constant noise loses the ability to perceive subtle sounds. A person who lives in artificial light loses the night vision that would let them see by starlight. The faculty does not disappear all at once, but it atrophies, it grows insensitive. It requires more and more stimulation to register anything at all, until eventually the person, surrounded by the same God who was always near, can no longer perceive him, and concludes falsely that he must have withdrawn. This is one of the cruelest deceptions in the whole experience of a prayerless life. The soul that has stopped praying begins to feel that God has grown distant, when in fact it is the soul itself that has lost the capacity to perceive a nearness that has not changed at all. God has not moved. The prophet Jeremiah, speaking the word of the Lord, asks, "Am I a God at hand and not a God afar off? Can any hide himself in secret places that I shall not see him? Do not I fill heaven and earth?" God fills heaven and earth. He is no less present in the room with the prayerless person than in the room with the praying one. The difference is not in God's location. The difference is in the soul's perception, and the soul's perception was being maintained by the very communion that has now ceased. Consider the experience of the psalmist who wrote, "As the hart panteth after the water brooks, so panteth my soul after thee, O God. My soul thirsteth for God, for the living God. When shall I come and appear before God?" This is the language of a soul that has known the nearness of God and is now feeling its absence. And notice that the psalmist does not conclude that God has abandoned him. He experiences the absence as a thirst, an ache, a panting desperation for a presence he remembers and longs to recover. This is the healthy response to the fading of God's felt nearness, not the cold rationalization that says feelings do not matter anyway, but the holy thirst that drives the soul back toward the source. The psalmist's thirst is itself an act of turning, a movement back toward God, the first motion of return. And it is significant that he expresses this thirst in prayer. Even his lament over God's felt absence is itself a prayer, which means that even in the driest season, the moment the soul cries out, the breathing has resumed and the nearness begins to be restored. But the soul that does not cry out, that does not allow the fading nearness to become a holy thirst, that instead grows comfortable with the dimness and stops noticing the absence, that soul enters a far more dangerous condition. Because the absence of felt nearness, when it is not grieved and not resisted, becomes the new normal. The soul forgets what nearness felt like. It builds a whole way of living around the assumption of God's distance. And from that assumption, everything else begins to deteriorate, because the felt nearness of God was doing far more work in the soul than the soul ever realized. It was the warmth that kept fear at bay. It was the assurance that quieted anxiety. It was the companionship that made loneliness bearable. It was the awareness that gave weight and meaning and sacredness to ordinary moments. Take it away, and all of those things begin to unravel one after another in a chain reaction that the soul experiences as a generalized darkening of life without ever quite tracing it back to its source. This is why the loss of God's felt nearness is the first thing to go, and in many ways, the most consequential. It is the first domino. And the truth that nobody tells you is that this first loss is almost entirely silent. It does not announce itself. It does not feel like a catastrophe at the moment it occurs. It feels like nothing, which is precisely the problem, because the soul that feels nothing where it once felt the warmth of God has not gained sophistication. It has begun to grow numb. And numbness in the spiritual life is not peace. It is the early symptom of a starvation that will, if left unaddressed, hollow out the whole interior life of a person, and leave them wondering years later why everything feels so grey, so flat, so empty, so far from the vivid and living faith they once knew. Part 3. The rise of anxiety. What fills the space where prayer used to be nature? The old saying goes, abhors a vacuum. And the soul, it turns out, abhors one even more. When prayer stops, it does not simply leave behind an empty space, a clean and neutral absence. Something rushes in to fill the void. And the thing that rushes in, more often than anything else, is anxiety. This is one of the most reliable and most overlooked consequences of a prayerless life. And once you understand the mechanism, you will recognize it everywhere, in others and in yourself. The connection between the cessation of prayer and the rise of anxiety is not coincidental. It is structural. It is built into the very design of the soul. The Apostle Paul, in the passage from Philippians that we will return to more than once in this study, lays the mechanism out with startling clarity. He writes, "Be careful for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known unto God. And the peace of God, which passeth all understanding, shall keep your hearts and minds through Christ Jesus." Notice the structure of this instruction. It is not merely, "Do not be anxious." That command alone would be cruel and useless, like telling a drowning man to simply stop sinking. No. Paul gives the command, and then immediately gives the mechanism that makes obedience possible. Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer, make your requests known to God. The "but" is doing enormous work. It is presenting prayer as the direct alternative to anxiety, the activity that occupies the same territory in the soul, the thing that either fills the space or leaves it open for anxiety to fill. Think carefully about what anxiety actually is. The Greek word Paul uses for being anxious is merimnao, and it derives from a root that means to divide, to split, to be pulled apart. Anxiety is the experience of a mind divided against itself, fragmented, pulled in multiple directions at once by competing fears and unresolved worries. It is the soul trying to carry the full weight of its future, every possible outcome, every imaginable threat, every uncertainty that cannot be resolved entirely in its own strength, with no one to share the load. And here is the crucial insight. This is precisely the burden that prayer was designed to lift. When you pray, you're not merely informing God of things He already knows. You're transferring the weight. You're taking the burden that has been pressing down on you and casting it onto shoulders infinitely broader than your own. You're moving from the posture of a person trying to manage the universe alone to the posture of a child entrusting their cares to a father who is both able and willing to carry them. So what happens when prayer stops? The weight does not disappear. The cares of life do not vanish simply because you have stopped praying about them. The bills still come, the diagnoses still arrive, the relationships still strain, the future remains as uncertain as it ever was. But now there is no mechanism for transferring the weight. There is no casting of cares onto a stronger shoulder. There is only you, carrying the full, crushing load of your existence entirely alone, with no relief valve, no sharing of the burden, no place to put it down. And the soul, designed to carry its cares to God, and finding that it no longer does, begins to buckle under a weight it was never meant to bear by itself. That buckling is what we call anxiety. It is the predictable, almost mechanical result of a soul attempting to do alone what it was designed to do in partnership with God. This is why so many people who stop praying find, often to their bewilderment, that their anxiety levels climb in the months and years that follow. They cannot always trace the connection. They look for external causes, a stressful job, a difficult season, the general turbulence of the times, and those external factors are real and they do contribute. But underneath the external factors is a structural change in how the soul processes its cares. When prayer was active, every worry had somewhere to go. It would arise, and it would be carried to God, and the act of carrying it would relieve its pressure. Now the worries arise and have nowhere to go. They accumulate, they circulate endlessly in the mind, returning again and again, growing larger with each return, because there is no longer any mechanism for releasing them. The prayerless mind becomes a closed loop of worry, a room with no exit in which fears are generated and never discharged, multiplying in the dark. Peter, the apostle who had personally been delivered from a lifetime of fear by the grace of God, wrote to suffering believers an instruction that goes to the heart of this dynamic. He said, "Casting all your care upon him, for he careth for you." The word he uses for casting is vivid and physical. It is not a gentle setting down. It is a throwing, a hurling, an active and forceful transfer of something heavy from yourself onto someone else. Cast your care upon him. Throw it, get it off of you and onto the one who can carry it. And the reason this is possible, the reason the throwing makes sense, is contained in the 4 words that follow. For he careth for you. Not, he might care if you do enough to earn his attention. Not, he cares about humanity in general. For he careth, present tense, continuous, personal, for you. The specific you, with your specific cares, your specific fears, your specific situation. The casting of cares is possible because there is someone on the receiving end who genuinely, personally, tenderly cares about the state of your heart. But the casting requires prayer. There is no other mechanism for it. You cannot cast your care upon God by simply thinking about casting it, or by intending to cast it someday, or by believing in principle that he is able to carry it. The casting happens in the act of prayer, in the actual bringing of the actual care into the actual presence of God, in words or groans or wordless turning, and the actual releasing of it into his hands. And so the soul that has stopped praying has, by definition, stopped casting its cares. The cares pile up, uncast, ungiven, unreleased. And the soul that holds all its cares unreleased is, again by definition, an anxious soul. The anxiety is not a mysterious affliction that strikes from nowhere. It is the natural and necessary consequence of a soul that has stopped doing the one thing that was keeping it free. There is a further dimension to this that is worth naming, because it explains why the anxiety of a prayerless life often has a particular quality of restlessness, a kind of low-grade churning that never fully resolves. When the soul is in regular communion with God, it develops what we might call a settled center. There is a place deep within, beneath the surface turbulence of daily life, beneath the comings and goings of circumstance, that remains anchored, quiet, secure, because it is in constant contact with the unchanging God. The storms may rage on the surface, but the depths are calm, because the depths are tethered to someone who does not move. This is the peace that Paul says passeth all understanding, the peace that cannot be accounted for by circumstances, the peace that shall keep, and that word keep, phrorio in the Greek, is a military term meaning to garrison, to mount guard, to post a sentinel. The peace of God stands guard over the heart and mind of the praying person like a soldier at his post, preventing anxiety from establishing its occupation. When prayer stops, the guard is withdrawn. The settled center loses its tether, and now there is nothing beneath the surface turbulence, no calm depths, no anchored place, no garrison standing watch. The turbulence goes all the way down. The storms on the surface reach into the depths because there are no longer any depths that are protected from them. And this is why the anxiety of a prayerless soul often feels bottomless, why it seems to have no floor, why it produces that particular sensation of free fall, of having nothing solid to stand on, of being adrift with no anchor, in an endless and indifferent sea. It is not that the prayerless person faces worse circumstances than the praying person. Often the circumstances are identical. The difference is that one of them has a garrison standing guard over the depths, and one of them does not. One of them is tethered to the unmoving God, and one of them has cut the tether and is now being carried wherever the current of fear decides to take them. The truth that nobody tells you is this: a great deal of the anxiety that floods modern life, the chronic, low-grade, ever-present unease that so many people carry as though it were simply a feature of being alive, is, at least in part, the predictable result of souls that have stopped breathing in the rhythm they were designed for. It is the sound of cares that have nowhere to go. It is the churning of depths that have lost their anchor. It is the alarm of a guard's post that has been abandoned. And the remedy is not, in the end, a technique. It is not a breathing exercise or a mindfulness app, useful as those things may be at the surface level. The remedy is the restoration of the breathing itself, the resumption of the casting, the return to the one who said, "Cast all your care upon me, for I care for you." The moment the cares begin to be cast again, the moment the breathing resumes, the moment the prayer begins, however haltingly, however imperfectly, the guard returns to his post, the depths begin to settle, and the peace that passes understanding begins, once again, to stand watch over a heart that had forgotten what peace even felt like. Part 4. The hardening. How a prayerless heart slowly loses its tenderness. There is a process that the scriptures describe with a recurring and sobering word: hardening, the hardening of the heart. It is one of the most frequently mentioned spiritual dangers in the entire Bible, and yet it is one of the least understood because we tend to imagine it as a dramatic event, a sudden act of defiance, a deliberate closing of the heart against God in a moment of conscious rebellion. And occasionally it does happen that way, but far more often the hardening of the heart is not an event at all. It is a process. A slow, quiet, almost imperceptible loss of tenderness, sensitivity, and responsiveness that takes place over a long stretch of time. And one of the most common engines of that hardening is the cessation of prayer. To understand this, we have to understand what keeps a heart tender in the first place. The human heart, left entirely to itself, does not naturally grow softer over time. The opposite is true. The natural drift of the unprayed-for heart is toward hardness, toward calcification, toward a kind of protective shell that forms over the tender places as a defense against the disappointments and wounds and frustrations of life. This is simply what hearts do when they are not actively kept soft. They harden, the way skin hardens into callus where it is repeatedly rubbed, the way ground hardens into a crust where it is never broken up. Tenderness is not the default. Tenderness is a condition that must be maintained, and it is maintained in large part through the regular softening work of prayer. What does prayer do to keep the heart tender? Several things, all of them quiet and cumulative. First, prayer keeps the heart in regular contact with the love of God. And there is nothing in all the universe more capable of softening a hard heart than the experience of being genuinely loved. When you spend time in prayer, really in it, not merely going through motions, but actually turning your heart toward God and dwelling in His presence, you are repeatedly exposed to His love, His grace, His mercy, His tenderness toward you. And that exposure works on the heart the way warmth works on something frozen. It thaws, it softens, it restores the capacity to feel. A heart that is regularly bathed in the love of God remains capable of love, capable of being moved, of being touched, of responding to others with compassion and warmth. But a heart that is cut off from that regular exposure begins to freeze over again, and the freezing manifests as a growing coldness, a diminishing capacity to be moved by the things that should move us. Second, prayer keeps the conscience sensitive. When you bring your life regularly before God, examining it in His presence, confessing what needs confessing, allowing His light to shine into the corners you would rather keep dark, your conscience remains alive, responsive, quick to register the difference between right and wrong, but the conscience, like every other faculty, dulls with disuse. The soul that no longer brings its life before God in prayer no longer subjects its conscience to that regular examination, and the conscience begins to grow quiet, not because the soul has become more righteous, but because the alarm system has been allowed to go silent. Things that once would have troubled the conscience now pass unnoticed. Compromises that once would have caused a pang of conviction are now made without a second thought. The voice that once said, "This is wrong," grows fainter and fainter, not because it has been silenced by argument, but because it has been ignored so long that it has stopped speaking up. This is the hardening of the conscience, and it is one of the gravest consequences of a prayerless life, because a hardened conscience is a soul that has lost its capacity to course correct, a ship that has lost its compass and does not even know it is lost. Third, prayer keeps the heart humble, and humility is the soil in which tenderness grows. There is something about the regular practice of coming before God, of acknowledging Him as God and ourselves as creatures, of bringing our needs and our failures and our dependence into His presence, that keeps us rightly sized in our own estimation. Prayer is, at its root, an admission of need. It is the posture of a person who knows they cannot do it alone, who comes with open hands, who depends on someone greater than themselves. And that posture, maintained over time, keeps the heart humble. But the soul that stops praying loses that regular humbling. It begins, subtly, to operate as though it were self-sufficient, as though it could manage its own life, secure its own future, meet its own needs without reference to God. And self-sufficiency, even when it is not consciously chosen, is the very essence of pride. The prayerless soul drifts, almost inevitably, toward a quiet, practical pride, an operating assumption of independence. And pride is the great hardener of hearts. It was pride that hardened Pharaoh's heart against God. It was pride that hardened the hearts of the religious leaders against Jesus. And it is a quiet, unexamined, practical pride that hardens the heart of the person who has stopped depending on God in prayer. The writer of Hebrews issues a warning that bears directly on this process. He writes, "Take heed, brethren, lest there be in any of you an evil heart of unbelief in departing from the living God. But exhort one another daily, while it is called today, lest any of you be hardened through the deceitfulness of sin." Notice the phrase, the deceitfulness of sin. The hardening happens through deceitfulness. It is not honest. It does not announce itself. It tells the heart that everything is fine, that nothing is changing, that the gradual cooling is actually maturity, that the diminishing sensitivity is actually stability. The deceitfulness of sin whispers reassurances, even as the hardening proceeds, which is exactly why the warning is necessary, exactly why the writer of Hebrews adds that little word daily, exhort one another daily, because the hardening is a daily process, an accumulation of small calcifications, and it requires a daily counter-process to resist it. And prayer is the heart of that daily counter-process. The daily turning toward God in prayer is the daily breaking up of the hardening ground, the daily thawing of the freezing heart, the daily softening that keeps tenderness alive. I want to describe what this hardening looks like in actual experience, because it is so subtle that many people are well into it before they recognize it, and some never recognize it at all. It looks like a growing impatience with people you used to be patient with. It looks like a diminishing capacity to be moved by beauty, by suffering, by the needs of others, by the things of God. It looks like a cynicism that creeps in where wonder used to be. It looks like a hardness in your reactions, a sharpness in your words, a quickness to judge and a slowness to forgive. It looks like sitting through things that once would have brought you to tears and feeling nothing. It looks like hearing the gospel, the very gospel that once overwhelmed you with gratitude and feeling only a flat familiarity, a yes, yes, I know all that has lost all its power to move you. It looks like a life that is becoming, year by year, a little colder, a little harder, a little more closed, while you tell yourself the whole time that you are simply growing up, settling down, becoming more realistic about the world. And here is the part that nobody tells you, the part that makes this so urgent. The hardened heart loses its ability to recognize its own hardening. This is the cruelest feature of the whole process. A soft heart can feel itself growing hard and be alarmed by it. But a heart that has already hardened significantly has lost the very sensitivity that would allow it to perceive the problem. It feels its hardness as normal, as reasonable, as simply the way things are. The hardening is self-concealing. It removes the very faculty that would sound the alarm, and so the person who has drifted furthest into the hardening of a prayerless life is often the person least able to recognize it, the person most likely to insist that everything is fine, that they are doing well, that their faith is mature and stable, when in fact a tenderness that was once alive in them has quietly frozen solid. If anything in this description has stirred even a flicker of recognition in you, if some part of you, hearing this, has felt a small ache, a faint sense that yes, perhaps something in me has been growing colder than I realized, then I want you to receive that flicker as one of the most hopeful things that could possibly happen to you right now. Because the very fact that you can feel it means the hardening is not complete. The very fact that the description stirs something means there is still tenderness left to recover, still a soft place that the freezing has not entirely overtaken. That ache you feel is the ember that has not gone out. It is the part of your heart that is still capable of being thawed. And the thawing begins the very moment you turn back toward the warmth, the moment you begin again, however haltingly, to pray. God specializes in hearts of stone. He made a promise through the prophet Ezekiel that speaks directly to this condition. A new heart also will I give you, and a new spirit will I put within you. And I will take away the stony heart out of your flesh, and I will give you an heart of flesh. He does not merely soften the stony heart, he replaces it. He is in the business of giving hearts of flesh to people who had given up on ever feeling anything again. And that work begins where it always begins, in the turning, in the breathing, in the prayer. Part 5. The loss of spiritual hearing. When you can no longer discern his voice. One of the most precious capacities of a praying soul is the ability to hear God, not audibly in most cases, but in that deeper way that the scriptures describe, the way of inward leading, of gentle conviction, of the still small voice that guides and corrects and comforts beneath the noise of conscious thought. Jesus said, "My sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me." The hearing of God's voice is presented in Scripture not as a rare gift granted to spiritual elites, but as a normal feature of belonging to Christ. The sheep hear the shepherd's voice. That is simply what sheep do. It is part of the relationship. And this hearing, this capacity to discern the leading of God in the ordinary decisions and moments of life, is one of the great treasures of a life in communion with Him. And it is one of the casualties of a prayerless life. The hearing of God's voice is not magic, and it is not automatic. It is a learned sensitivity developed and maintained through relationship, and the relationship is sustained through prayer. Consider how it works in any deep human relationship. Two people who have known each other intimately for many years develop an ability to read each other, to sense each other's meaning, to hear the unspoken beneath the spoken. A husband can tell from the way his wife says a single word what she is really feeling. A close friend can sense from across a room that something is wrong. This sensitivity is not a supernatural endowment. It is the natural fruit of long, attentive, intimate relationship. The more time you spend with someone attentively, the better you come to know their voice, their meaning, their heart. And the same principle governs our hearing of God. The more time we spend with Him in prayer, speaking, but also listening, also waiting, also attending to Him in His word, the more attuned we become to His voice, the more readily we recognize His leading, the more sensitively we perceive His gentle this way and not that way, His comfort and His correction. Now consider what happens to that sensitivity when the relationship is neglected. It does not vanish all at once, but it degrades. The voice that was once so recognizable becomes harder to distinguish. The leading that once seemed clear becomes ambiguous. The soul that has stopped praying finds, when it tries to discern God's will in some matter, that it can no longer tell His voice from the clamor of its own desires and fears and the thousand competing voices of the world. The signal has not stopped transmitting. God has not gone silent, but the receiver has lost its tuning. The instrument has gone out of adjustment through disuse. And the prayerless soul, attempting to navigate the decisions of life, finds itself increasingly without reliable guidance, increasingly thrown back on its own unaided judgment, increasingly likely to mistake the voice of its own appetite for the voice of God. This loss of spiritual hearing has consequences that ripple through the whole of life. So many of the decisions we face are not matters of clear right and wrong, where the path is obvious to anyone. They are matters of wisdom, of timing, of discernment, where two reasonable options present themselves, and the question is which one God is leading toward. Should I take this job or that one? Should I speak now or wait? Should I pursue this relationship or step back? Should I stay or should I go? In such decisions, the praying soul has an enormous advantage. It has access to the guidance of the one who sees the end from the beginning, who knows what lies down each path, who loves us and wills our genuine good. The praying soul can bring the decision into the presence of God, can lay it before Him, can wait for the inner sense of peace or unease that so often functions as His guidance, can perceive the gentle leading of His Spirit. But the prayerless soul has lost this access. It must navigate by its own unaided sight, in the dark, without the guidance it was meant to have, and so it stumbles. It makes decisions it would not have made with God's leading. It walks into situations it would have been warned away from. It misses opportunities it would have been guided toward. Its life begins, slowly, to wander off course, not because it is being punished, but because it has lost the navigation that prayer provided. There is a particular passage in the life of the prophet Elijah that speaks profoundly to this dimension of the prayerless life, though it is usually read for other purposes. After his great triumph on Mount Carmel, Elijah collapsed into exhaustion and fear and despair, and he fled into the wilderness. And there at the cave of Horeb, God came to him. But notice how God came. There was a great and strong wind that tore the mountains and broke the rocks, but the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a still small voice. A voice so quiet that it could only be heard by a soul that was attentive, that was listening, that was tuned to perceive something subtle beneath the roar of the dramatic. This is so often how God speaks, not in the loud and the dramatic and the unmistakable, but in the still small voice that requires a listening soul to hear it. And the still small voice is precisely the kind of voice that the prayerless soul, with its degraded spiritual hearing, can no longer perceive. The dramatic might still get through. A crisis, a catastrophe, a loud and undeniable event might still register. But the still small voice, the gentle daily leading, the quiet conviction, the soft this way, These grow inaudible to a soul that has lost its tuning. And there is a further loss here, one that goes even deeper. The hearing of God's voice is not only a matter of guidance for decisions, it is a matter of intimacy, of relationship, of the sheer joy of knowing and being known. There is a profound comfort in hearing God speak to your heart, a word of love in a lonely hour, a word of reassurance in a frightened one, a word of correction that you know comes from a heart that wants your good, a sense of His pleasure in a moment of obedience. These quiet communications are some of the deepest joys of the spiritual life, and they are mediated through the listening that is part of prayer. The soul that has stopped praying has stopped listening, and so it no longer receives these communications. It lives in a kind of relational silence, no longer hearing the voice of the one who loves it, and the silence over time breeds a terrible loneliness, the loneliness of a child who has stopped hearing its father's voice, who begins to wonder whether the father is still there, whether the father still cares, whether the relationship was ever real at all. But I want to be very clear about the nature of this silence, because it is so easily misunderstood. The silence is not God's. God has not stopped speaking. The still small voice is still speaking. It has not been withdrawn. The shepherd is still calling his sheep by name. The call has not ceased. The silence is on the side of the soul that has lost its hearing. And this is enormously hopeful, because a hearing that has been lost through disuse can be recovered through use. The instrument that has gone out of tune can be tuned again. The sensitivity that has atrophied can be rebuilt. It happens the same way it was built in the first place, through the patient resumption of communion, through the turning of attention back toward God, through the practice of listening that is part of all real prayer. At first, the soul that returns to prayer after a long silence may hear nothing, may strain and perceive only its own thoughts, may wonder whether the hearing is gone for good. But it is not gone. It is rusty, and rust gives way to use. Day by day, as the communion is restored, the tuning returns, the sensitivity rebuilds, and one day, often when least expected, the soul hears it again. The still, small voice, the gentle leading, the word of love spoken into the deep place, and the loneliness of the long silence begins finally to lift. Part 6. The Famine of Joy. Why everything goes grey without prayer. There is a particular quality to the life of a soul that has stopped praying, and once you learn to recognize it, you will see it everywhere. It is a greyness, a flatness, a draining of color and vividness and delight from a life that may, on every external measure, be going perfectly well. The person experiencing it often cannot name it. They have everything they are supposed to have. They are doing everything they are supposed to do, and yet a strange joylessness has settled over everything, a sense that the savor has gone out of life, that they are going through the motions of an existence that no longer delights them the way it once did. This is the famine of joy, and it is one of the quietest and most pervasive consequences of a prayerless life. To understand the famine, we have to understand where joy actually comes from. And here, as with so much else, the popular understanding leads us astray. We tend to think of joy as something produced by favorable circumstances. We are joyful when good things happen and joyless when they do not. And there is a kind of happiness that works exactly that way, a circumstantial happiness that rises and falls with the fortunes of the day. But the joy that the Scriptures describe, the deep and durable joy that is meant to be a normal feature of the believing life, does not work that way at all. It is not produced by circumstances. It is produced by communion. It is a fruit. The Scriptures explicitly call it a fruit of the Spirit, and like all fruit, it grows from a living connection to a source. Cut the connection, and the fruit withers, regardless of how favorable the external circumstances may be. Jesus made this connection explicit in his final discourse to his disciples. Speaking of the relationship between himself and his followers as a vine and its branches, he said, "These things have I spoken unto you, that my joy might remain in you, and that your joy might be full." Notice the structure of that statement. The joy that fills the believer is his joy, Christ's own joy, remaining in them. It is not a joy they generate, it is a joy that flows into them from him, through the living connection between the branch and the vine. And he places this statement in the very same passage where he gives his great command to abide, meno, the word for remaining, dwelling, staying connected. The full joy comes from the abiding. The abiding is the connection, and the connection is sustained, as all the New Testament makes clear, through prayer and communion with God. Take away the abiding, sever the connection, stop the communion, and the joy, which was flowing from the vine into the branch, ceases to flow. The branch does not die immediately. It may stay green for a while on its stored reserves, but the joy stops coming, because joy was never something the branch produced. It was something the branch received. This is why the famine of joy is so bewildering to the people who experience it. They keep looking at their circumstances, trying to find the external cause of their joylessness, and they cannot find it, because the cause is not external. They have good jobs, and they are joyless. They have loving families, and they are joyless. They achieve their goals, and the achievement tastes like ashes. They get the thing they wanted, and the wanting simply moves on to something else, because the thing, whatever it was never capable of producing the joy they were looking for. Circumstantial happiness can rise and fall, but the deep joy, the joy that gives savor to life, that makes ordinary moments glow, that allows a person to find delight even in difficulty, that joy comes only from communion with the source of all joy. And the soul that has stopped praying has stopped drawing from that source, and so it experiences a famine that no amount of favorable circumstance can relieve. Consider the testimony of the psalmist David, who knew both the heights of communion with God and the depths of its loss. In Psalm 16 he writes, "Thou wilt show me the path of life. In thy presence is fullness of joy. At thy right hand there are pleasures forevermore. In thy presence is fullness of joy." The fullness of joy is located in God's presence. It is not located in circumstances, in achievements, in possessions, in pleasures of any earthly kind. It is in His presence. And the presence of God is precisely what prayer cultivates and prayerlessness loses. The soul that dwells in God's presence, that turns toward Him, communes with Him, abides in Him through prayer, has access to the fullness of joy, regardless of circumstance. And the soul that has wandered from that presence has wandered from the fullness of joy, and will not find it again anywhere else, no matter how diligently it searches, because it is not anywhere else to be found. David's most piercing prayer on this subject comes in Psalm 51, after his great fall, when he had wandered far from God and felt the full grayness of that distance. He prays, "Restore unto me the joy of thy salvation." Notice what he asks for. Not give me the joy of better circumstances, not improve my situation so that I might be happy again. Restore unto me the joy of thy salvation. He had not lost his salvation, but he had lost the joy of it. The thing itself remained, but the savor had drained out. He could no longer feel what he once felt. The gospel that had once filled him with delight had gone flat and grey in the season of his wandering. And his prayer for the recovery of that joy is itself the beginning of the recovery, because the prayer is itself a return, a turning back toward the presence in which the fullness of joy is found. The joy begins to return the moment the soul turns back toward its source. I want to name something about this famine that is rarely acknowledged, because it explains a great deal about the strange restlessness of so many lives. When the soul loses the deep joy that comes from communion with God, it does not simply accept the loss and live joylessly. It goes searching. It looks for substitutes. It tries to fill the joy-shaped emptiness with whatever the world offers: pleasures, possessions, experiences, achievements, entertainments, relationships, the endless scroll of distraction. And because none of these things can actually fill the emptiness, because the emptiness is shaped for God and can be filled by nothing else, the soul finds itself in a desperate and exhausting cycle, consuming more and more, chasing the next thing and the next, always hoping that this time the emptiness will be filled, always discovering that it is not. This is the restless consumption that characterizes so much of modern life, and underneath a great deal of it is a famine of joy in souls that have stopped drawing from the only source that could satisfy them. They are starving, and they keep eating things that cannot nourish them, and they cannot understand why they are still hungry. They are still hungry because the hunger is for God, and they have been feeding it everything except God. The truth that nobody tells you is that the grayness is not permanent, and it is not a sign that life itself has become gray. The color has not gone out of the world. It has gone out of your perception, because the faculty that perceived it was nourished by communion and has been starved by neglect. The same world that looks grey to the prayerless soul will look luminous again to the soul that returns to communion. Not because the world has changed, but because the soul's capacity for joy has been restored. The famine ends where it began, in the presence of God. The fullness of joy is still there at His right hand, where it has always been, waiting for the soul that turns back toward it. And the turning can begin right now. The prayer that restores the joy is not a complicated prayer. It is the simple turning of the heart back toward the source, the simple acknowledgement of the hunger, the simple asking, "Restore unto me the joy." And the God who delights to give joy to His children begins, the moment He is asked, to pour it back into the famished soul, until the grayness lifts and the color returns and life begins, once again, to taste like life. Part 7. The erosion of identity. Forgetting who and whose you are. Among the deepest and most disorienting consequences of a prayerless life is one that operates at the very foundation of the self, the erosion of identity. To understand this, we have to grasp something that the modern world has largely forgotten: that identity is not something you generate from within yourself, but something you receive from outside yourself, from the source of your being, and that the receiving happens in significant part through communion with that source. The praying soul is continually reminded of who it is and whose it is. The prayerless soul, cut off from that continual reminding, begins to forget, and a soul that has forgotten who and whose it is becomes a soul adrift, vulnerable, anxious, and endlessly susceptible to having its identity dictated by every passing voice and circumstance. Let us consider how identity is formed and sustained in the praying life. When you come before God in prayer, you are not merely making requests. You are entering into a relationship in which your truest identity is established and reaffirmed. You come as a child to a father. The Spirit Himself, Paul tells us, bears witness with our spirit that we are the children of God, and the cry that the Spirit produces in the praying heart is, "Abba, Father," the intimate, tender, familial address of a child who knows they belong. Every time you pray, this identity is reinforced. You are reminded at the deepest level that you are a child of God, beloved, adopted, secure, belonging to the household of the living God. You are reminded that your worth is not something you have to earn, but something that has been bestowed on you by the one who made you and redeemed you. You are reminded that you are known, fully known, completely known, known better than you know yourself, and that the one who knows you completely loves you completely. This is the bedrock of a stable identity, and it is laid and relaid day by day in the practice of prayer. Now consider what happens when the prayer stops. The reinforcement stops, the reminding stops. The identity that was being continually established and reaffirmed is no longer being maintained, and like everything else that is not maintained, it begins to erode. The soul slowly forgets that it is a beloved child. It loses its grip on the truth that its worth is bestowed and not earned. And into the vacuum left by this forgetting rush, all the false identities that the world is endlessly eager to assign. The world says, you are what you achieve, you are what you own, you are what others think of you, you are your usefulness, your productivity, your appearance, your success, your failures. And the soul that has lost its grip on its true identity, the identity received in communion with God, has nothing with which to resist these false assignments. It begins to define itself by these external and shifting standards, and because these standards are external and shifting, the soul's sense of itself becomes external and shifting too, rising and falling with every success and failure, every gain and loss, every approving or disapproving glance from the world. This is the source of a particular kind of exhaustion that characterizes so many lives, the exhaustion of a self that is constantly trying to establish its own worth, constantly performing, constantly proving, constantly anxious about how it is being measured and whether it is measuring up. This exhaustion is the direct result of an identity that has been cut loose from its true foundation and is now attempting to generate itself from its own achievements. It is the exhaustion of a person who has forgotten that they are already loved, already valued, already secure, and who is therefore frantically trying to earn what they already possess. And it is, at root, a consequence of prayerlessness, of the cessation of the communion in which the true identity was being received and maintained. The Apostle John, in his old age, gave us one of the most beautiful examples of an identity rooted in the right foundation. Throughout his gospel, he refers to himself not by his name, not by his accomplishments, not by his apostolic authority, but by a single description, the disciple whom Jesus loved. This was the foundation of his whole sense of self, not what he had done for Jesus, though he had done much, not how faithfully he had served, though he had served long. The deepest, truest thing he knew about himself was what Jesus had done for him. Jesus loved him. He was the one Jesus loved. And this identity, received and maintained through a lifetime of communion, made John one of the most stable, secure, and unshakable figures in the entire New Testament. He outlived all the other apostles. He endured persecution and exile and the loss of everyone he had loved. And through it all, he remained anchored because his identity was anchored in something that could not be touched by any of it, the love of Christ for him, received continually in the communion of a praying life. The soul that has stopped praying has stopped receiving this anchoring, and so it becomes susceptible to a particular and tragic confusion. It begins to believe that it is what it does, what it has, what others say of it. And because all of those things are unstable, the soul becomes unstable. It cannot find solid ground. It rises with success and crashes with failure. It is inflated by praise and devastated by criticism. It has no fixed center because the fixed center, the identity received in communion with God, has eroded away. And the more it erodes, the more frantically the soul searches for some external thing to anchor itself to. And the more it anchors itself to external things, the more unstable it becomes, in a vicious cycle that can consume an entire life. There is a deeper layer to this erosion that deserves to be named because it touches on the relationship between identity and purpose. The soul that knows who and whose it is also knows, in a fundamental sense, what it is for. A child of God who is secure in that identity understands that their life has a purpose that flows from their relationship with their Father. To know Him, to love Him, to glorify Him, to serve His purposes in the world, to be conformed to the image of His Son. This purpose gives shape and direction and meaning to the whole of life. But the soul that has lost its identity has also lost its sense of purpose. It no longer knows what it is for. And a soul without a sense of purpose is a soul that drifts, that wanders, that fills its days with activity but cannot find meaning in any of it, that achieves its goals and finds the achievement hollow because it has lost the larger frame that would have given the achievement significance. The famous restlessness that the Church Father Augustine named, "Our heart is restless until it finds its rest in Thee," is, in part, this loss of purpose, this drifting of a soul that has forgotten what it is for because it has forgotten whose it is. And yet, and here is the great mercy that runs through this entire study, none of this erosion is irreversible. The identity that has been forgotten can be remembered. The foundation that has been neglected can be reclaimed. And the remembering happens in exactly the place where the identity was first received, in communion with God, in prayer, in the turning of the heart back toward the Father who has never stopped regarding you as His beloved child. The moment you return to prayer, the reinforcement resumes. The reminding begins again. The Spirit, who had never stopped bearing witness, is heard again, crying, "Abba, Father," in the depths of the returning heart. And the soul begins to remember what it had forgotten, that it is loved, that it belongs, that its worth was never something it had to earn, that it is and has always been and will always be a beloved child of the living God. The false identities begin to lose their grip. The exhausting performance begins to cease. The frantic searching for external anchors begins to quiet, because the true anchor has been found again. You are the one God loves. That was always who you were. And in returning to prayer, you return to the place where that truth is spoken over you again and again, until it becomes once more the bedrock of your whole life. Part 8. The weakening of resistance. Why the prayerless soul falls more easily. There is a sobering pattern that runs throughout the Scriptures and throughout the experience of every honest believer. The soul that has stopped praying is a soul that falls more easily. Its resistance to temptation weakens. Its capacity to stand firm in trial diminishes. Its defenses against the pressures and seductions and assaults of life are lowered. And this is not a coincidence or a mere correlation. It is a direct, structural consequence of the cessation of prayer, because prayer is, among its many functions, one of the primary means by which the soul is strengthened, guarded, and made able to stand. Jesus Himself made this connection with unmistakable clarity in the Garden of Gethsemane. On the night of His arrest, He had brought His disciples with Him to the garden, and He had asked them to watch and pray while He went a little farther to pray alone. And when He returned and found them sleeping, He said to them words that have echoed through the centuries as one of the clearest statements in all of Scripture about the relationship between prayer and the ability to withstand temptation. Watch and pray, that ye enter not into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. Watch and pray, that you enter not into temptation. The praying is presented as the very thing that keeps the soul from entering into temptation, that strengthens it against the weakness of the flesh, that prepares it to stand in the hour of trial. And the disciples, who did not pray that night, who slept instead of watching, who neglected the very prayer Jesus had urged on them, proved the point with devastating clarity within hours. When the moment of testing came, they did not stand. They fled. Peter, who had not prayed in the garden, denied his Lord 3 times before the night was out. The prayerless disciples fell, and Jesus, who had prayed in agony until his sweat was like great drops of blood, walked into the worst suffering in human history with a composure and a steadfastness that astonished even his executioners. The difference between standing and falling on that night was the difference between those who had prayed and those who had not. Why does prayer strengthen the soul against temptation, and why does its absence weaken the soul's resistance? There are several reasons, and they work together. First, prayer keeps the soul in conscious dependence on God's strength rather than its own. The great vulnerability of the soul that faces temptation is self-reliance, the assumption that it can stand in its own strength, that its own willpower and resolve are sufficient to resist whatever comes. But the flesh, as Jesus said, is weak. The soul's own strength is never sufficient, and the praying soul knows this. The very act of prayer is an admission of dependence, a reaching out for a strength beyond its own. The prayerless soul, by contrast, has drifted into self-reliance, has stopped reaching for God's strength, and is therefore attempting to stand against temptation on the strength of the flesh alone, which is to say, on a strength that is guaranteed to fail when the pressure becomes great enough. The prayerless soul falls not because it faces stronger temptations than the praying soul, but because it faces them with weaker resources, having cut itself off from the strength that alone is sufficient. Second, prayer keeps the soul's affections rightly ordered, and rightly ordered affections are one of the great defenses against temptation. Temptation works in large part by making something forbidden appear more desirable than it is, by inflating its promised pleasure and obscuring its real cost. The soul falls when its affections are disordered, when it desires the forbidden thing more than it desires God and the good. And prayer is one of the primary means by which the affections are kept in order, because in prayer the soul is repeatedly reminded of the surpassing worth of God, repeatedly exposed to a goodness and a beauty and a love that puts the seductions of temptation in their proper diminished perspective. The soul that is regularly delighting in God finds the lures of temptation less compelling because it has tasted something better. But the soul that has stopped praying has stopped tasting that better thing, and so the lures of temptation grow proportionally more compelling. When the higher delight is gone, the lower delights rush in to fill the vacuum, and the soul, no longer anchored by its love for God, is swept along by lesser loves it can no longer resist. Third, prayer maintains the soul's spiritual alertness, its watchfulness, its awareness of the spiritual dimension of the battles it faces. The prayerless soul tends to grow spiritually drowsy, like the disciples in the garden, no longer alert to the reality of temptation, no longer watchful, no longer aware that it is in a battle at all. And a soul that does not know it is in a battle is a soul that will be caught off guard. Peter, who had failed so badly in the garden, later wrote with hard-won wisdom, "Be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary the devil, as a roaring lion, walketh about, seeking whom he may devour." Be vigilant, stay alert. There is a real adversary, and he is actively seeking those he may devour, and the soul that has drifted into spiritual drowsiness through the neglect of prayer is exactly the kind of soul that he finds easiest to devour. The praying soul is watchful, it sees the danger coming, it is prepared. The prayerless soul is drowsy, it does not see the danger until it is upon it. It is caught unprepared. And in spiritual warfare, as in any warfare, the unprepared are the ones who fall. I want to be careful here, because this is a subject on which the church has sometimes spoken in ways that produce fear and shame rather than hope and strength, and that is not my intention at all. I'm not saying that every fall is a simple matter of insufficient prayer, as though prayer were a magic shield that makes the soul invulnerable and any failure proof of spiritual negligence. The reality of temptation and failure is more complex than that. And there are godly praying souls who fall, and there is grace in abundance for everyone who does. But I am saying, because it is true, and because it is one of the things nobody tells you, that the general pattern is real. The soul that maintains its communion with God through prayer is, all else being equal, a soul that is better defended, better strengthened, better able to stand than the soul that has let that communion lapse. The prayerless life is a more exposed life, a more vulnerable life, a life lived with the defenses lowered and the strengthening cut off. And this exposure is felt over time as a growing sense of being unable to resist things one used to resist, a kind of moral and spiritual softening, a discovery that the things which once held no power over you have somehow gained a grip, that the line you once would never have crossed is now crossed with disturbing ease. If you have experienced this, if you have felt yourself growing weaker against things you used to stand against, falling more easily into patterns you used to resist, finding your defenses lowered in ways that trouble you, then I want you to understand the connection that nobody draws for you. It may be, in significant part, that your defenses have been lowered because the strengthening has been cut off, because the communion that fortified you has lapsed, because you have been trying to stand in your own strength against forces that no human strength can withstand. And the remedy is not, primarily, to try harder, to grit your teeth, to summon more willpower, for the flesh is weak, and willpower alone will fail you in the end. The remedy is to return to the source of the strength you have been doing without. It is to take up again the watching and the praying that Jesus urged on his sleeping disciples. It is to re-establish the dependence, reorder the affections, recover the alertness, all of which are renewed in communion with God. The soul that returns to prayer does not merely feel better, it becomes stronger. Its defenses are raised again, its resistance is restored. It begins once again to be able to stand. And in the hour of testing, which will come as it comes to everyone, it finds that it has once again the strength to stand firm, not its own strength, which was never enough, but the strength of the one who said, "My grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made perfect in weakness." Part 9. The shrinking of vision. How the prayerless soul loses sight of eternity. One of the most subtle and far-reaching consequences of a prayerless life is the shrinking of vision, the gradual narrowing of the soul's horizon until it can see nothing beyond the immediate, the visible, the temporal, the merely earthly. The praying soul lives with a double vision. It sees both the seen and the unseen, both the temporal and the eternal, both the immediate circumstances and the larger story within which those circumstances find their meaning. But the prayerless soul slowly loses the second sight. The unseen fades from view, the eternal recedes, and the soul finds itself trapped in the merely immediate, unable to see beyond the next problem, the next deadline, the next anxiety, having lost the larger perspective that once gave everything its proper scale and significance. The Apostle Paul described the double vision of the believing soul in his second letter to the Corinthians, written from the midst of tremendous suffering and pressure. While we look not at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen, for the things which are seen are temporal, but the things which are not seen are eternal. We look not at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. This is a learned vision, a cultivated perception, a way of seeing that does not come naturally and must be continually renewed. The natural eye sees only the seen, the circumstances, the problems, the visible realities that press in on every side. It takes a different kind of seeing to perceive the unseen, the presence of God, the reality of eternity, the larger story, the things that are permanent rather than passing. And this different kind of seeing is cultivated more than anywhere else in prayer. In prayer, the soul lifts its eyes from the immediate to the eternal. It turns its attention from the seen to the unseen. It is reminded again and again that the visible circumstances that loom so large are in fact temporary, passing, light and momentary in the scale of eternity, while the unseen realities that the natural eye overlooks are in fact the weightier, the more enduring, the ultimately real. When prayer stops, this lifting of the eyes stops. The soul's gaze drops to the immediate and stays there. And without the regular renewal of the eternal perspective, the immediate begins to swell, to fill the whole field of vision, to take on a weight and an urgency and a finality that it does not actually possess. The problem that is, in the scale of eternity, a small and passing thing comes to feel like the whole of reality. The anxiety that would shrink to its proper size in the light of eternity grows monstrous in the absence of that light. The soul loses all sense of proportion, because proportion requires the larger frame, and the larger frame is supplied by the eternal vision that prayer cultivates and prayerlessness loses. This is why the prayerless soul so often experiences its troubles as overwhelming, as crushing, as more than it can bear, not necessarily because its troubles are objectively greater than others, but because it has lost the perspective that would cut those troubles down to their true size. It is seeing everything up close, with no horizon, no distance, no scale, and everything seen up close, with no larger frame, looks enormous. There is a profound psychological and spiritual freedom that comes from the eternal perspective, and the loss of it is felt as a loss of freedom, a kind of imprisonment in the immediate. The soul that can see eternity is a soul that can endure almost anything in time, because it knows that time is not the whole story, that the sufferings of the present moment are not the final word, that there is a larger and more glorious reality toward which everything is moving. This is what allowed the martyrs to face death with peace, what allowed Paul and Silas to sing in prison, what allowed believers across the centuries to endure losses and hardships that would have crushed them had the present moment been all they could see. They could see beyond it. They could see the eternal weight of glory that Paul says the light and momentary afflictions are working out. And that vision set them free, free from the tyranny of the immediate, free from the crushing weight of circumstances that they knew to be temporary, free to live with hope and even joy in the midst of suffering, because they were looking not at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. The prayerless soul loses this freedom. Trapped in the immediate, unable to see beyond the visible, it experiences the full crushing weight of every circumstance with no relief, no perspective, no hope of anything beyond. And this contributes enormously to the heaviness, the despair, the sense of being overwhelmed that so often characterizes a prayerless life. It is not only that the soul has lost the felt presence of God, lost its joy, lost its peace, lost its strength. It has also lost its sight, its capacity to see the larger reality that would give all of its struggles a different and more bearable meaning. It is living in a small, dark room with no windows, when it was meant to be living in a house with windows opening onto eternity. This shrinking of vision has a particularly devastating effect on the soul's relationship to suffering and loss. When the eternal perspective is intact, suffering and loss, while still painful, are held within a frame that gives them meaning and limits their power. The believer can grieve, but not as those who have no hope, because they know that death is not the end, that what is lost is not lost forever, that there is a resurrection and a restoration and a making new of all things toward which the whole creation is moving. But the soul that has lost the eternal vision grieves as those who have no hope, because hope is precisely what the eternal vision supplies, and the eternal vision is precisely what has faded. Loss becomes final. Death becomes the end. Suffering becomes meaningless. And the soul is left to face the hardest experiences of human life, which come to everyone, believer and unbeliever alike, without the resource that was meant to carry it through them, the resource of an eternal hope that prayer keeps alive and prayerlessness lets die. I think of the way the book of Revelation ends, with the vision given to the aged apostle John on the island of his exile, a vision of the final reality toward which everything is moving, a vision of God dwelling with his people, wiping away every tear from their eyes, abolishing death and sorrow and crying and pain, making all things new. This is the eternal vision in its fullest and most glorious form, and it was given to a man who had lost almost everything the world could take from him, who was old and exiled and alone, who had watched all his friends die for their faith. And the vision sustained him. It gave him a horizon vast enough to contain all his losses and a hope strong enough to outweigh all his sufferings. He could endure the immediate because he could see the eternal. And the same vision is available to every praying soul, renewed and refreshed in every season of communion, lifting the eyes from the immediate to the eternal, restoring the proportion that the prayerless life had lost, setting the soul free once again from the tyranny of the merely visible. The truth that nobody tells you is that the heaviness of a prayerless life is, in significant part, a heaviness of vision, a soul crushed not only by the weight of its circumstances, but by the loss of the perspective that would lighten that weight. And the recovery of vision comes with the recovery of prayer. As the soul returns to communion with God, the eyes begin to lift again, the horizon begins to reappear, the eternal begins to come back into view, and the circumstances that had swollen to fill the whole field of vision begin to shrink back to their proper size, held once again within the vast frame of eternity where they belong. The soul that had been imprisoned in the immediate finds the windows opening again, finds itself able once more to see the larger reality, finds the freedom and the hope and the proportion that it had lost. And it discovers that the troubles which had seemed so overwhelming, while still real, are once again bearable, because they are once again seen for what they are, light and momentary afflictions, working out an eternal weight of glory in the hands of a God who is making all things new. Part 10. The quiet loneliness, the relational cost of a prayerless life. We turn now to a consequence of prayerlessness that touches the deepest and most tender part of the human experience, loneliness. There is a particular quality of loneliness that settles over the soul that has stopped praying, and it is unlike any other loneliness because it is not the loneliness of having no people around you. You can be surrounded by people, by family, by friends, by colleagues, by crowds, and still carry this loneliness because it is not a loneliness of human company. It is a loneliness of divine communion. It is the loneliness of a soul that has lost touch with the one presence it was most deeply designed to know. And no amount of human company can fill the space that was made for God. To understand this loneliness, we have to understand that the human being was created for relationship with God before, beneath, and beyond all human relationships. The capacity for human relationship is real and precious and a great gift, but it sits atop a deeper capacity, the capacity for relationship with God. And the deeper capacity is the foundation of the shallower ones. When the relationship with God is healthy, the human relationships find their proper place. They are enjoyed without being required to bear a weight they cannot bear, because the deepest need of the soul is being met at the deeper level. But when the relationship with God is neglected, when the communion has lapsed, the soul begins to demand of its human relationships a fulfillment they were never designed to provide. It looks to other people to fill the God-shaped emptiness, and other people, however loving, however present, cannot fill it. And so the soul experiences a strange and painful loneliness, even in the midst of human company, a loneliness that confuses it, because it cannot understand why it feels so alone when it is surrounded by people who love it. The praying soul knows a companionship that runs beneath all its human relationships and sustains it even when human company is absent. It knows what it is to be alone and not lonely, because it is never truly alone. The presence of God is with it, attending to it, communing with it, filling the quiet places with a companionship that human presence cannot match and human absence cannot remove. This is one of the great secrets of the saints, this capacity to be alone without being lonely, to find in solitude not emptiness but a deeper fullness, because solitude with God is not loneliness at all, but the most intimate of all companionships. The Desert Fathers sought solitude precisely because it removed the distractions of human company and left them alone with the one whose company they most desired. They were not lonely in the desert. They were, in a sense, less lonely than they had ever been, because they had stripped away everything that distracted them from the presence of God. But the prayerless soul has lost this companionship, and so it has lost the capacity to be alone without being lonely. Solitude for the prayerless soul is not a deeper fullness, but a frightening emptiness. The quiet, which the praying soul fills with the presence of God, becomes for the prayerless soul a void it cannot bear, a silence that presses in on it, a loneliness it must flee. And this is why so many people in our age cannot bear to be alone, cannot bear silence, cannot bear a single unfilled moment, but must always have noise, distraction, stimulation, company, the constant input of screens and sounds and activity. They are fleeing the silence, because the silence for a soul that has lost its communion with God is unbearable. It confronts them with the emptiness, the loneliness, the absence at the center of their being. And rather than enter that silence and discover that it is not empty after all, that God is waiting there in the quiet, they flee it, filling every moment with noise, never discovering that the very silence they fear is the doorway to the communion they most need. There is a beautiful and poignant moment in the Gospels that illuminates this whole dynamic. Again and again, we are told, Jesus withdrew to solitary places to pray. The Son of God, who was himself in perfect communion with the Father, nonetheless sought out solitude for the express purpose of prayer, of communion, of being alone with the Father. And these times of solitary prayer were not a burden he endured, but a sustenance he sought, a refreshment, a deep drawing on the relationship that was the source of his whole life and ministry. If even Jesus needed and sought these times of solitary communion, how much more do we? And notice that for Jesus, solitude and prayer went together. The solitude was for the prayer, and the prayer transformed the solitude from mere aloneness into intimate communion. This is the pattern that the prayerless soul has lost. It has solitude without prayer, aloneness without communion, silence without the presence that fills it. And so its solitude is mere loneliness, its silence mere emptiness, its aloneness a thing to be fled rather than sought. I want to name something about modern loneliness that I think is rarely connected to its true source. We live in what has been called an epidemic of loneliness. People are more connected than ever by every technological measure, and lonelier than ever by every measure that matters. And there are many contributing factors to this, social and cultural and economic, which are real and worth addressing. But I want to suggest that beneath all of those factors lies a deeper one that is almost never named. A generation of souls that has to a large degree lost its communion with God and is therefore experiencing the particular loneliness that comes from that loss, the loneliness of a soul cut off from the companionship it was most deeply designed for, trying and failing to fill the resulting emptiness with human connection that cannot fill it. The God-shaped emptiness cannot be filled by people, by relationships, by social connection, however good and valuable those things are in their place. It can be filled only by God. And a generation that has stopped seeking God in prayer is a generation that has left the God-shaped emptiness unfilled and is therefore lonely at a level that no amount of human connection can reach. The deepest loneliness, then, is the loneliness of the prayerless soul, and the deepest remedy is the resumption of prayer. When the soul returns to communion with God, it discovers, often with surprise and relief, that it was never as alone as it felt. The companionship it had lost was not gone. It was merely unaccessed, waiting to be taken up again. The presence of God, which had seemed to withdraw, had never actually departed. It was the soul that had withdrawn its attention, and the moment the attention returns, the presence is found to have been there all along, and the loneliness that had pressed in so heavily begins to lift, not because the soul's human relationships have changed, but because the deeper relationship has been restored. The God-shaped emptiness has begun to be filled by the only one who can fill it, and the soul has recovered its capacity to be alone without being lonely, to find in solitude not emptiness, but the most intimate of all companionships. "I will not leave you comfortless," Jesus promised his disciples. "I will come to you." The word he used for comfortless is the word for orphaned, left alone without a parent's care. "I will not leave you as orphans," he said. "I will come to you." And that promise stands for every lonely, prayerless soul that turns back toward him. He comes. He has never been far. And the loneliness finally ends. Part 11, the drift into self-reliance, the subtle pride of the prayerless life. We have touched on this several times in passing, but it deserves its own careful examination, because it is in many ways the root from which several other consequences grow. The drift of the prayerless soul into self-reliance and the subtle pride that self-reliance represents. This is perhaps the least obvious of all the consequences we are exploring, because it does not feel like pride. It does not look like the obvious arrogance that we usually associate with that word. It is a quiet, practical, often unconscious pride, the pride of a soul that has begun, without ever deciding to live as though it could manage its own life without God. And this quiet pride is both a cause and a consequence of prayerlessness, locked in a self-reinforcing cycle that, left unchecked, carries the soul further and further from the dependence on God that it was created for. Consider what prayer fundamentally is, at its root. It is an admission of need. It is the posture of a creature before its creator, a child before its father, a dependent before the one on whom it depends. When you pray, you are acknowledging in the very act that you cannot do it alone, that you need help, that you are not self-sufficient, that there is someone greater than yourself on whom your life depends. Prayer is, in this sense, the great enemy of pride, the great cultivator of humility, the regular and necessary admission of dependence that keeps the soul rightly sized in its own estimation. The praying soul is a humble soul, not because it works hard at being humble, but because the regular practice of prayer keeps reminding it of its dependence, keeps it in the posture of the one who needs, keeps pride from taking root. And here is the crucial insight. The cessation of prayer is, whether the soul intends it or not, the cessation of this regular admission of dependence. The soul that stops praying stops acknowledging its need. It stops coming with open hands. It stops reminding itself day by day that it cannot do it alone. And in the absence of this regular humbling, the soul begins, slowly and unconsciously, to operate as though it could do it alone. It begins to rely on its own resources, its own intelligence, its own planning, its own strength. It begins to manage its life as a self-sufficient project, to be secured by its own efforts. And this practical self-sufficiency, this operating assumption of independence, is the very essence of pride, not the loud, obvious pride of the boaster, but the quiet, deep, dangerous pride of the soul that has forgotten its need for God. The prophet Hosea recorded a word from the Lord that captures this dynamic with painful precision. Speaking of his people, God says, "According to their pasture, so were they filled. They were filled, and their heart was exalted. Therefore have they forgotten me. According to their pasture they were filled, and being filled, their heart was exalted, and being exalted, they forgot God. This is the progression. The soul receives good things, a good pasture, a season of plenty, success, security, comfort. And being filled, being comfortable, having its needs apparently met, its heart is exalted. It begins to feel self-sufficient, no longer needy, no longer dependent. And being exalted in this way, it forgets God. The felt need that drove it to seek Him has been temporarily satisfied by the good pasture, and so the seeking ceases, the prayer ceases, the communion ceases, and God is forgotten. This is one of the great dangers of prosperity and comfort. They reduce the felt sense of need, and in reducing the felt sense of need, they reduce the impulse to pray, and in reducing the impulse to pray, they open the door to the self-reliance that forgets God altogether. This explains a paradox that has puzzled observers throughout history, that prayer often flourishes most in seasons of difficulty and withers most in seasons of ease. When life is hard, when needs are pressing, when the soul is confronted daily with its own inability to manage its circumstances, prayer comes easily because the felt need that drives prayer is acute. But when life is easy, when needs are met, when the soul feels comfortable and secure, prayer withers because the felt need that drives it has been dulled by comfort. This is why some of the most prayerful seasons of a person's life are often their hardest seasons, and why prosperity, which seems like a blessing, can be a profound spiritual danger. Not because comfort is wrong, but because comfort dulls the sense of need that keeps the soul dependent and praying. The drift into self-reliance is, in this sense, often a drift that begins in a season of ease, when the soul, no longer feeling its desperate need for God, gradually stops coming to Him and gradually begins to rely on itself and gradually forgets, in the deep places, that it ever needed Him at all. The danger of this self-reliance is not only that it is a form of pride, though it is, and pride is described throughout Scripture as the root of all manner of falling. The danger is also intensely practical. The self-reliant soul is a soul that has cut itself off from the resources it most needs, attempting to live its life on the strength of the creature when it was designed to live on the strength of the Creator. It is like a branch that has decided it can produce fruit on its own, apart from the vine. And the result is exactly what Jesus described. Without me, ye can do nothing. Apart from me, you can do nothing. Not you can do less, not you will find it harder. Nothing. The branch apart from the vine cannot produce fruit at all, no matter how hard it strains, because fruit was never something the branch produced from its own resources. It was always something the branch received from the vine and bore. And the self-reliant soul, having cut itself off from the vine through the cessation of communion, finds sooner or later that all its straining produces nothing of lasting value, that its self-sufficient efforts come to nothing, that it has been laboring in its own strength to do what can only be done in the strength of God. There is a particular bitterness to the discovery that the self-reliant soul eventually makes when its own resources finally prove insufficient, as they always eventually do. The soul that has been managing its life by its own strength comes sooner or later to a situation it cannot manage, a crisis too large, a sorrow too deep, a problem too intractable for its own resources to handle. And in that moment, it discovers that it has been living on a strength that has limits, that its self-sufficiency was an illusion, that there are walls it cannot break through and weights it cannot carry and depths it cannot cross on its own. This discovery is painful, but it is also merciful, because it is often the very thing that breaks the drift into self-reliance and drives the soul back to God. The crisis that the self-sufficient soul cannot handle becomes the occasion of its return, Confronted at last with the limits of its own strength, it remembers its need, and remembering its need, it prays, and praying, it begins to recover the dependence it had lost. God, in His mercy, often allows the self-reliant soul to come to the end of its own resources precisely so that it will turn back to Him. The wall it cannot break through is the wall that turns it around and sends it home. But it need not take a crisis. The drift into self-reliance can be reversed at any moment by the simple resumption of the humbling practice of prayer. The moment the soul begins again to come before God with open hands, to admit its need, to acknowledge its dependence, the quiet pride begins to dissolve and the humility begins to return. And with the humility comes, once again, access to the resources of God that self-reliance had cut off. The branch, reconnected to the vine, begins once again to bear fruit, not by straining but by abiding. The soul, reconnected to its source, begins once again to live in the strength of God rather than the insufficient strength of the creature. And it discovers, often with relief, that it was never meant to carry the weight of its own life alone, that the self-sufficiency it had drifted into was not freedom but a kind of bondage, a wearisome and ultimately impossible attempt to be its own God. The return to prayer is the return to the proper order of things, the creature once again depending on the Creator, the child once again trusting the Father, the branch once again drawing life from the vine. And in that return, there is rest, the rest of a soul that has finally laid down the impossible burden of self-sufficiency and taken up again the light and easy yoke of dependence on the one who said, "Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." Part 12, what prayer is not, clearing away the misunderstandings that keep us from returning. If we are going to talk honestly about returning to prayer, and that is, in the end, what this entire study is moving toward, then we have to clear away some of the misunderstandings about prayer that keep people from returning to it. Because very often the soul that has drifted from prayer does not return, even when it longs to, because it carries false ideas about what prayer is, ideas that make the prospect of returning seem daunting or pointless or impossibly demanding. These false ideas are obstacles, and they need to be removed, gently and clearly, so that the way back can be seen for what it is. Not a steep and forbidding climb, but a simple turning toward one who is already near. The first and most common misunderstanding is that prayer is primarily about performance, that it must be done correctly, with the right words, the right posture, the right length, the right level of feeling, or it does not count. This misunderstanding turns prayer into a kind of religious technique, an art to be mastered, a skill at which one might succeed or fail. And it is devastating, because it makes the prayerless soul feel that it cannot simply return, that it would first have to relearn how to do it properly, that its rusty and halting attempts would somehow not be good enough. But this is entirely false. Prayer is not a performance, it is a relationship. It is not a technique to be mastered, it is a conversation to be entered. And God is not evaluating the quality of your prayers the way a judge evaluates a performance. He is receiving the turning of your heart toward Him, however halting, however clumsy, however wordless. Some of the most powerful prayers in all of Scripture are the shortest and simplest. "Lord, save me," cried Peter as he sank. "God, be merciful to me, a sinner," prayed the tax collector who went home justified. "Lord, I believe, help thou mine unbelief," cried the desperate father. These are not polished performances. They are raw, simple, desperate turnings of the heart toward God. And they were heard, they were answered. They were precisely the kind of prayer that God delights to receive. You do not need the right words. You need only to turn. The second misunderstanding is that prayer is primarily about feeling, that unless you feel something, unless there is some experience of warmth or presence or emotion, the prayer has not worked. This too is devastating to the returning soul, because the soul that returns after a long absence often feels nothing at first. The felt presence that it lost was lost precisely because the communion lapsed, and it will take time for that felt presence to return as the communion is rebuilt. If the soul believes that prayer requires feeling, then its first feelingless attempts will discourage it, and it will conclude that prayer is not working, and it will give up. But prayer does not require feeling. Feeling is sometimes a gift that accompanies prayer, but it is not the substance of prayer and not the measure of its validity. The driest, most feelingless prayer, offered in the will rather than the emotions, turning the heart toward God, even when the heart feels nothing, is fully heard and fully valid. Indeed, the prayer offered without feeling, simply out of obedience and trust, is in some ways more pure than the prayer that depends on feeling, because it is offered for God's sake rather than for the sake of the experience it produces. The returning soul should expect to feel little or nothing at first, and should not be discouraged by it, but should continue, knowing that the feeling, if it comes, will come in time, and that the prayer is valid and heard, whether the feeling comes or not. The third misunderstanding is that prayer requires large amounts of time, that to pray properly one must set aside long stretches, and that the soul too busy for long stretches cannot really pray. This misunderstanding keeps countless souls from prayer because they believe they do not have the time, that anything less than a substantial dedicated period does not count. But while extended times of prayer are precious and valuable, prayer is not measured by duration, and the busy soul can pray richly in the midst of its busyness. The instruction to pray without ceasing is not an instruction to spend every hour on one's knees. It is an instruction to maintain a continuous orientation of the heart toward God, a running conversation, a habitual turning that can happen in the cracks and corners of the busiest day. A breath of prayer in the morning. A turning of the heart while driving. A silent cry for help in the middle of a difficult conversation. A word of thanks at an unexpected beauty. A moment of communion while washing the dishes. These brief, frequent turnings, accumulated through the day, are prayer, real prayer, and they can sustain a rich communion with God, even in a life that has no long stretches of solitude. The returning soul need not wait until it can find an hour. It can begin right now, in this moment, with a single breath turned Godward, and build from there. The fourth misunderstanding, and perhaps the most paralyzing, is that the soul which has drifted far from God has somehow disqualified itself from prayer, that its long absence has created a barrier, that it would be presumptuous or hypocritical to come back to prayer after such a long neglect. This misunderstanding is perhaps the most tragic of all, because it keeps the soul that most needs to return from returning, out of a false sense that it has forfeited the right. But the entire gospel stands against this idea. The God of the gospel is the God who runs to meet the prodigal while he is still a great way off. The father in Jesus' parable does not wait for the returning son to prove himself, does not require a probationary period, does not demand that the son earn his way back, but runs to him, embraces him, restores him before the son can even finish his rehearsed speech of repentance. This is the God to whom the prayerless soul returns. There is no barrier of long absence that he has erected. There is no disqualification that the soul's neglect has earned. The door is open, the welcome is warm, the Father is watching the road. And the soul that has drifted furthest, that feels most disqualified, that has been gone the longest, is precisely the soul that the gospel most eagerly invites to come home. Let me say it as plainly as I can, because I want this to land in the deep place where the obstacles have been keeping you out. You do not have to pray well to pray. You do not have to feel anything to pray. You do not have to have a lot of time to pray, and you most certainly do not have to be worthy or qualified or far enough along in your recovery to pray. You have to do only one thing, the one thing that prayer essentially is: turn your heart toward God. That is all. That is the whole of it. The simplest turning, the briefest word, the most halting and wordless reaching of the heart toward the one who made it. That is prayer. Real prayer, fully received and fully heard. And it is available to you right now, in this exact moment, exactly as you are, with all your rust and all your distance and all your felt unworthiness, because the God to whom you would turn is not standing at a distance evaluating your fitness to approach. He is right beside you, nearer than your own breath, watching the road, longing for the turning, ready to run to meet you the moment you take a single step toward home. Part 13. The God who waited. What he was doing in the silence. We have spent a great deal of this study examining what happens to the soul in the silence of a prayerless life. But there is another side to that silence that we have not yet fully explored, and it is perhaps the most beautiful and most hope-giving truth in this entire study, what God was doing during all that time. Because the silence, while it was happening, can feel from the human side like abandonment, like absence, like a relationship that has gone dormant on both ends. But it was never dormant on God's end. The whole time the soul was silent, God was not. The whole time the prayer had stopped, the love had not. And understanding what God was doing in the silence transforms the entire experience of return, because it means the soul is not returning to a God who has been away, but to a God who never left, who was present and active and loving throughout the entire silence, even though the soul could not perceive it. What was God doing in the silence? First, he was keeping you. The scriptures are full of the language of God's keeping, his preserving, his sustaining, his upholding of his people, often without their awareness. He that keepeth thee will not slumber, says the psalmist. Behold, he that keepeth Israel shall neither slumber nor sleep. God's keeping does not depend on our praying. He keeps us when we are awake and when we are asleep, when we are praying and when we are not, when we are aware of him and when we have forgotten him entirely. Throughout the whole silence of your prayerless season, God was keeping you, sustaining your life, upholding your existence, preserving you from countless dangers you never knew about, watching over you with a vigilance that never slumbered. Even as you slept spiritually and forgot to seek him, the keeping never stopped. The God who keeps does not abandon his post when his child stops talking to him. He keeps watching, keeps sustaining, keeps preserving through all the silent years. Second, he was pursuing you. The God of the Scriptures is a pursuing God, a seeking God, a God who goes after the lost sheep, who searches for the lost coin, who watches the road for the returning son. He did not passively wait for you to come back. He actively pursued you throughout your absence. The pursuit may have been quiet, may have been gentle, may have operated through means you did not recognize at the time. A stirring of conscience, an ache of longing, a moment of unexpected beauty that pointed beyond itself, a circumstance that brought you low, a memory that surfaced unbidden, a word spoken by someone who did not know what they were doing. All these and 1,000 more were the methods of his pursuit, the ways he kept reaching for you, kept calling you, kept drawing you back, even when you did not know he was doing it. The fact that you are here now, reading these words, seeking the way back, that itself is evidence of the pursuit. You did not stumble here by accident. You were sought. You were drawn. The God who never stopped pursuing you has, in his persistence, brought you to this moment of return. Third, he was preparing your return. The God who sees the end from the beginning was, throughout your silence, preparing the moment and the means of your return. He was working in your circumstances, in your heart, in the depths you could not see, to bring you to the point of turning back. The very dissatisfaction you felt in the prayerless years, the grayness, the anxiety, the loneliness, the ache, these were not only the symptoms of your distance from God, they were also the means by which He was drawing you home, the holy discontent He was cultivating to make you long for what you had lost. He was using even your suffering, even the consequences of your prayerlessness, to prepare your return, to make the famine of the far country so acute that, like the prodigal, you would come to yourself and remember the Father's house and rise and go home. Nothing was wasted. Even the wandering was being woven into the larger story of your return, by a God who is able to work all things together for good for those whom He loves. And fourth, throughout the entire silence, He was loving you. This is the deepest truth of all, and the one most contrary to what the prayerless soul tends to assume. The prayerless soul tends to assume that its distance from God has cooled God's love for it, that the long silence has created a coldness on God's side as it has on the soul's side, that it is returning to a God who is, at best, reluctantly willing to take it back. But this is entirely false. God's love, as we have seen, is not a response to our performance, but an expression of His unchanging nature. He is love. He cannot be otherwise. And His love for you did not cool by a single degree throughout the entire silence of your prayerless years. He loved you exactly as much on the day you forgot Him as on the day you first sought Him. He loved you in the depths of your wandering exactly as much as He loves you now in the moment of your return. The love was constant. The love was unchanged. The love was, the whole time, reaching toward you with the same intensity it had always had, the same intensity with which the Father loves the Son, the same love that sent Jesus to the cross, the same love that will never let you go. You were never, for one moment of the entire silence, unloved. You were never out of His heart. You were never beyond the reach of His affection. The whole time you were not praying, He was loving you, fully, completely, unchangingly, with a love that your silence could not diminish and your distance could not cool. There is a parable Jesus told that captures the whole of this truth, the parable of the prodigal son, and it is worth dwelling on for a moment because it is, in many ways, the parable of every prayerless soul and its return. The younger son takes his inheritance and goes into a far country and wastes it all in reckless living, and finds himself, at last, in a famine, feeding pigs, longing to eat the husks the pigs ate, having sunk as low as a Jewish young man could possibly sink. And in that far country, in that famine, in that degradation, he comes to himself, and he remembers his father's house, and he rises and goes home. And here is the detail that matters most for our purposes. While he was yet a great way off, his father saw him, which means the father was watching the road. The father had been watching the road presumably every day of the son's absence, scanning the horizon, longing for the moment when a figure would appear in the distance. The father had not written the son off, had not closed the door, had not hardened his heart against the one who had so badly wronged him. He was watching, waiting, loving the whole time. And the moment the son appeared, while he was still far away, the father ran to him. Ran, an undignified thing for an elderly man in that culture to do, ran with all the eagerness of a love that had been waiting and longing for exactly this moment, and fell on his neck and kissed him and would not even let him finish his rehearsed speech of repentance before calling for the robe and the ring and the feast, restoring him fully, immediately, joyfully, to the place of a beloved son. That is the God to whom you are returning. That is what he was doing in the silence, watching the road. That is what he will do the moment you turn toward home, run to meet you. The silence was never empty on his side. He was keeping you, pursuing you, preparing your return, and loving you the whole time, with a love that never wavered. And he is watching the road right now. He has seen you, while you are yet a great way off. And he is already, even now, beginning to run. Part 14. The first step back. How the return actually begins. So how does the return actually begin? After everything we have explored, the drift, the consequences, the silence, the waiting God, how does a soul that has been far from prayer for a long time actually take the first step back? This is the most practical and most important question in the entire study, because all the understanding in the world is of no use if it does not result in an actual return, an actual resumption of the communion that was lost. And the wonderful truth, the truth that should fill the returning soul with hope rather than dread, is that the first step back is far smaller and far simpler than the soul tends to fear. The first step back is not a grand resolution. It is not a commitment to an ambitious new regimen of daily devotions, an hour of prayer every morning, a complete spiritual overhaul to be undertaken by sheer willpower. Such resolutions, made in a burst of enthusiasm, almost always collapse within days, leaving the soul more discouraged than before, more convinced of its inability to return, more entrenched in its prayerlessness. The first step back is not a grand resolution at all. It is a single turning. It is one prayer. It is one moment of turning the heart toward God right now, in whatever words or wordlessness the soul can manage. It is the prodigal's first step in the direction of home. Not the completion of the whole journey, not the arrival, just the first step, the turning of the body in the right direction and the lifting of the foot. And that single turning, that one prayer, is enough to begin everything. Because the moment the soul turns, however slightly, the dynamic reverses. The drift that had been carrying it away is interrupted. The movement toward God, however small, has begun. And just as the drift away from God was self-reinforcing, gathering momentum over time, so the movement back toward God is self-reinforcing, gathering its own momentum as it goes. The first prayer makes the second prayer easier. The first turning makes the next turning more natural. The breathing, once resumed, tends to continue. The soul that has taken one step toward home finds the second step a little less difficult, and the third less difficult still, until what began as a single halting turning becomes, over time, a restored rhythm of communion, a renewed life of prayer, a soul once again breathing in the rhythm it was designed for. What should that first prayer be? It can be anything. It can be the simplest, most honest words the soul can find. It can be, God, I have been away. I want to come back. It can be, Lord, I do not even know how to pray anymore. Help me. It can be, Father, here I am. It can be wordless, just a turning of the heart, a lifting of the attention, a reaching toward Him in the silence. It does not matter what the words are or whether there are any words at all. What matters is the turning, the directing of the heart toward God, the first motion of return. And whatever that first prayer is, however halting and small, it is received with the full joy of the Father, who sees the Son while He is yet a great way off. There is, Jesus tells us, joy in heaven over one sinner who repents. And the word for repentance, metanoia, means precisely this turning, this reorientation of the heart. The first turning of the prayerless soul back toward God sets off rejoicing in heaven. Your first halting prayer after all the silent years is an occasion of joy in the presence of the angels of God. That is how God receives the first step back. Not with reluctance, not with a probationary wariness, but with rejoicing. I want to address directly the soul that says, "But I have tried to return before, and it did not last. I prayed for a few days or a few weeks, and then I drifted away again. What is the point of starting if I am only going to fall away once more?" This is a real and common discouragement, and it deserves a real answer. The answer is this: the Christian life is not a single return, but a lifelong pattern of returning. Every saint who has ever lived has drifted and returned, many times over the course of their life. The drifting is not the failure. The staying away is the failure. And every return, no matter how many times you have returned before, no matter how many times you have drifted again after returning, is a genuine return, fully received, fully valid, fully joyful to the God who welcomes it. Peter denied his Lord and returned. David fell grievously and returned. The whole history of God's people is a history of drifting and returning, and the God of that history is infinitely patient with the returning, infinitely willing to receive the soul that comes back again, even for the 100th time, even for the 1,000th time. Do not let the fear that you might drift again keep you from returning now. Return now, and if you drift again, return again. And keep returning as many times as it takes for as long as you live, because the God who watches the road never tires of running to meet his children, no matter how many times they have wandered away. There is great wisdom as the soul takes its first steps back, in keeping the steps small and sustainable rather than large and unsustainable. The soul returning from a long absence should not attempt to leap immediately into the prayer life of a seasoned saint, any more than a person recovering from a long illness should attempt to immediately run a marathon. Start small. Start with a single moment of prayer in the morning, a single turning of the heart toward God at the start of the day. Start with a brief word of thanks before meals, a habit easily formed and easily sustained. Start with a single sentence of prayer at night before sleep. Start with the practice of turning the heart toward God in the small moments of the day. The brief and frequent turnings that, accumulated, become a continuous communion. These small, sustainable beginnings are far better than grand, unsustainable resolutions because they can actually be maintained, and being maintained they can grow naturally and organically into the fuller life of prayer that the soul desires. The mighty oak grows from the small acorn, and the rich prayer life grows from the small first turnings, faithfully sustained and allowed to grow. And the soul should remember through it all that it is not returning by its own strength. The very desire to return is itself a gift of grace, the work of the Holy Spirit drawing the soul back, the evidence of the God who is pursuing it. The soul does not generate its own return. It responds to a drawing that is already at work within it. And the same grace that draws the soul to return will sustain it in returning, will give it the strength to continue, will work in it the renewed life of prayer that it could never produce on its own. The return is not a work of human willpower, but a work of divine grace met by human response, and the soul that returns can lean its whole weight on the grace that is drawing it, trusting that the one who began the good work of return will be faithful to complete it. Faithful is he that calleth you, who also will do it. The God who is calling you back is the God who will do the work of bringing you back, if you will simply respond to the call, take the first small step, turn your heart toward home, and trust him to do the rest. Part 15. The Restoration. What returns when prayer returns? We have spent so much of this study tracing what is lost when prayer stops that it is time, now, to turn fully toward the far more joyful subject of what returns when prayer returns. Because everything that was lost in the silence can be restored in the return, and the restoration is, in many ways, more beautiful than the original possession, because it is received with a gratitude and a depth that the soul which never wandered cannot fully know. The soul that returns to prayer does not return to exactly what it had before. It returns to something richer, deepened by the very experience of having lost it and found it again. The first thing that returns is the felt nearness of God. Slowly, as the communion is rebuilt, as the soul takes up again the practice of turning toward God, the dulled perception begins to sharpen, the atrophied sensitivity begins to recover, and the soul begins once again to sense the nearness of the God who was always there. It does not happen all at once, usually. The felt nearness that was lost over months or years is not always restored in a day. But it does return, gradually, surely, as the communion deepens, until one day the soul realizes, perhaps with surprise, that it can feel him again, that the warmth has come back, that the sense of presence has returned, that the God who had seemed so distant is once again perceptibly near. And this returning nearness is sweeter for having been lost, more precious for having been absent, received with a gratitude that the soul which never lost it cannot fully appreciate. The prodigal who returns to the Father's house knows the value of that house in a way the son who never left does not, because he has known what it is to be without it. The second thing that returns is peace. As the soul resumes the casting of its cares upon God, as it takes up again the prayer that is the alternative to anxiety, the peace that passes understanding begins once more to stand guard over the heart and mind. The cares that had accumulated, uncast, in the prayerless years begin to be cast, one by one, onto the shoulders of the one who cares. The closed loop of worry begins to open. The worries that had circulated endlessly with nowhere to go now have somewhere to go again. The garrison returns to its post. The depths of the soul, retethered to the unmoving God, begin once again to settle, even as the storms continue on the surface. And the soul that had known only the bottomless anxiety of a prayerless life begins to know again the deep peace of a praying one, the peace that does not depend on circumstances, the peace that stands guard, the peace that the world cannot give and the world cannot take away. The third thing that returns is joy. As the soul reconnects to the source of all joy, the famine ends and the fullness returns. The grayness that had settled over everything begins to lift. The color comes back into the world. Life begins once again to taste like life. The deep joy that comes from communion with God, that flows from the vine into the branch, begins once again to flow, filling the soul with a delight that no circumstance had been able to provide and no circumstance can now remove. The restless searching for substitutes begins to cease because the real thing has been found. The desperate consumption that tried to fill the joy-shaped emptiness with everything except God begins to quiet, because the emptiness is being filled, at last, by the only one who can fill it. And the soul that had wandered through the grey famine of a prayerless life begins to know again the fullness of joy that is found in God's presence and nowhere else. The fourth thing that returns is the tenderness of heart. As the soul is once again regularly bathed in the love of God, the heart that had been hardening begins to soften, the freezing reverses, the capacity to feel, to be moved, to respond with compassion and warmth returns. The conscience, subjected once again to the regular examination of prayer, regains its sensitivity. The alarm system that had gone silent begins once more to sound. The cynicism that had crept in where wonder used to be begins to give way again to wonder. The hardness in the reactions, the sharpness in the words, the quickness to judge and slowness to forgive, all begin to soften as the love of God works again on the heart. And the soul that had been growing colder and harder year by year begins instead to grow warmer and softer, to recover the tenderness it had lost, to feel again the things it had stopped feeling in the great thawing that the return to communion brings. The fifth thing that returns is the hearing of God's voice, as the relationship is restored, as the soul takes up again the listening that is part of prayer. The degraded spiritual hearing begins to recover its tuning. At first, the soul may hear nothing, may strain and perceive only its own thoughts. But as the communion deepens, the sensitivity rebuilds, and one day, often when least expected, the soul hears it again. The still small voice, the gentle leading, the inward conviction, the word of love spoken into the deep place. The guidance that had been lost returns. The soul can once again discern the leading of God in the decisions of life, can once again perceive his gentle this way and not that way, can once again navigate by the light it had been doing without. And the loneliness of the long relational silence begins, finally, to lift as the soul hears once again the voice of the one who loves it. The sixth thing that returns is identity. As the soul comes once again before God in prayer, the continual reinforcement of its true identity resumes. The Spirit, who had never stopped bearing witness, is heard again, crying, "Abba, Father," in the depths of the returning heart. The soul begins to remember what it had forgotten, that it is a beloved child, that its worth is bestowed and not earned, that it is fully known and fully loved, that it belongs to the household of the living God. The false identities that had rushed in to fill the vacuum begin to lose their grip. The exhausting performance, the frantic proving, the constant anxiety about measuring up, all begin to quiet, because the true identity has been recovered, the true anchor has been found again. And the soul that had been adrift, defining itself by its achievements and possessions and the opinions of others, finds itself once again anchored in the one identity that cannot be shaken. It is the one God loves. And the seventh thing that returns, the thing that holds all the others together, is the relationship itself. For in the end, all of these gifts, the nearness and the peace and the joy and the tenderness and the hearing and the identity, are not really separate gifts at all. They are the various fruits of a single thing: the restored relationship with God, the renewed communion, the resumption of the breathing that the soul was designed for. Prayer was never, in the deepest sense, about any of these gifts individually. It was about the relationship from which they all flow. And what returns, when prayer returns, is the relationship, the living, breathing, intimate communion with the God who made us for himself, who has loved us through all our wandering, who has waited for us through all our silence, and who receives us when we return, with all the joy of a father welcoming home a child he had longed for every day of the absence. The relationship returns. And with the relationship, everything else. Part 16, the discipline and the delight, sustaining the restored life of prayer. Once the return has begun, once the first steps have been taken and the communion has started to be restored, a new question arises: how is the restored life of prayer to be sustained? Because the great danger after a return is a second drift, a gradual slipping back into the old patterns of neglect until the soul finds itself once again far from the prayer it had so recently recovered. And so it is worth giving some careful attention to how the restored life of prayer can be maintained, how it can be protected against the drift, how it can be deepened and strengthened over time into a stable and enduring communion that does not easily slip away. The first principle of sustaining the life of prayer is the recognition that prayer is both a discipline and a delight, and that these two are not opposites but partners. There is a tendency to think that prayer should be purely spontaneous, purely a matter of delight, and that any element of discipline, any scheduling or structure or deliberate effort, somehow contaminates it, makes it mechanical, robs it of its life. But this is a misunderstanding. The truth is that the delight of prayer is sustained over the long term precisely by the discipline of prayer. The seasons of felt delight come and go. There are times when prayer is sweet and times when it is dry, times when the heart is eager and times when it is reluctant. If prayer depends entirely on delight, on the feeling of wanting to pray, then it will be abandoned in every dry season, every reluctant hour, and the communion will be fragile, dependent on the unreliable weather of the emotions. But if prayer is grounded in discipline, in a deliberate commitment to pray regardless of feeling, in a structure and a habit that sustains the practice through the dry seasons as well as the sweet ones, then it endures, and the dry seasons pass, and the delight returns, and the soul that maintained the discipline through the dryness finds the delight again on the other side. This is the great secret that the saints have always known, that the discipline serves the delight, that the deliberate, committed, sometimes unfeeling practice of prayer is precisely what sustains the communion through the seasons when feeling fails, so that the communion endures, and the delight, when it returns, has something to return to. The soul that prays only when it feels like praying will pray little and inconsistently, and its communion will be shallow and fragile. But the soul that prays as a discipline, faithfully, through the dry seasons and the sweet ones alike, will find its communion deepening over time, growing stable and enduring, and will discover that the delight, far from being killed by the discipline, is actually sustained and even deepened by it. The discipline is the riverbed, the delight is the water. Without the riverbed, the water has nowhere to flow and dissipates. With the riverbed, the water is channeled, sustained, directed, and the river endures even through the dry seasons, ready to fill again when the rains return. The second principle of sustaining the life of prayer is the cultivation of regular rhythms. The soul is a creature of habit, and habit, rightly directed, is one of the great allies of the spiritual life. The establishment of regular times of prayer, a set time in the morning, a set time in the evening, set moments throughout the day, creates a structure that sustains the practice without requiring a fresh decision every time. When prayer depends on a fresh decision in each moment, on remembering and choosing to pray amid the distractions of the day, it is easily crowded out. There is always something more urgent, something more pressing, some reason to put it off. But when prayer is established as a regular rhythm, woven into the fabric of the day at set times, it happens by habit, by the momentum of an established pattern, without requiring the constant exertion of fresh decision. The morning prayer happens because it is what one does in the morning. The evening prayer happens because it is the established close of the day, and these regular rhythms, faithfully maintained, sustain the communion through all the busyness and distraction that would otherwise crowd it out. The third principle is the use of Scripture as the companion and fuel of prayer. Prayer that is cut off from the Word of God tends over time to become thin, repetitive, ingrown, circling endlessly around the same small set of concerns. But prayer that is fed by Scripture is endlessly renewed, drawing constantly on the inexhaustible riches of the Word, finding always new things to pray, new aspects of God to praise, new promises to claim, new truths to dwell on. The practice of praying the Scriptures, of reading a passage and then turning it into prayer, of letting the Word shape and direct and fuel the conversation with God, is one of the most ancient and most fruitful ways of sustaining a rich life of prayer. The Psalms, in particular, are the prayer book of the people of God, the inspired prayers and praises that have sustained believers for thousands of years. And the soul that prays the Psalms, that makes their words its own, finds an endless supply of language for every condition of the heart, every season of the soul, every circumstance of life. The Word feeds the prayer, and the prayer brings the Word alive, and the two together sustain a communion that neither could sustain alone. The fourth principle is honesty. The life of prayer is sustained by honesty and undermined by pretense. The soul that comes to God in prayer, pretending to be other than it is, performing a piety it does not feel, hiding the parts of itself it would rather not bring into the light, will find its prayer growing hollow and burdensome, a performance rather than a communion. But the soul that comes to God honestly, bringing its real condition, its real struggles, its real doubts and fears and failures, and even its real reluctance to pray, will find its prayer alive and real, a genuine meeting between a real soul and a real God. God is not honored by pretense. He is honored by honesty. He already knows the truth of our condition. The pretense deceives no one but ourselves. And the soul that learns to pray honestly, to bring its true self before God without disguise, discovers that this honesty is the very thing that makes prayer real, that opens the channel of genuine communion, that allows the relationship to be a relationship rather than a performance. Come as you are. Bring what is true. Hide nothing. This is the honesty that sustains the life of prayer. And the fifth principle is community. Though much of prayer is private, the solitary communion of the individual soul with God, the life of prayer is also sustained by the prayers of community, by the gathering of believers to pray together, to bear one another's burdens, to hold one another accountable, to encourage one another in the faith. The soul that tries to sustain its prayer life entirely alone, cut off from the community of believers, is more vulnerable to the drift, more likely to slip back into neglect, with no one to notice, no one to encourage, no one to call it back. But the soul that is embedded in a praying community is sustained by that community, encouraged by the example and the prayers and the accountability of others, carried through its dry seasons by the faith of those around it, called back when it begins to drift. Let us consider one another to provoke unto love and to good works, says the writer of Hebrews, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together. The gathering of the community is one of the great sustainers of the individual's life of prayer, and the soul that would maintain its communion with God is wise to maintain also its communion with God's people, who will help it stay faithful, help it stay awake, help it keep returning, through all the seasons of the long journey home. Part 17. The Witnesses. What the praying lives of others teach us. It is one thing to speak in general terms about the life of prayer and its loss and recovery. It is another thing to see it embodied in actual lives, to look at the witnesses who have gone before us, who lived out these truths in the concrete circumstances of their existence, and to learn from what we see in them. For the scriptures are full of such witnesses, men and women whose relationship with prayer, in its presence and its absence, in its rise and fall and recovery, teaches us more than any abstract principle could. Let us look at a few of them, and let what we see in them instruct and encourage us in our own journey. Consider first the figure of Daniel, the great example of a sustained life of prayer maintained through the most adverse circumstances imaginable. Daniel was carried away into exile as a young man, torn from his homeland, raised in the court of a pagan empire, surrounded by pressures and temptations and dangers on every side. And through it all, across a lifetime of service in the courts of foreign kings, Daniel maintained an unbroken life of prayer. We are told that it was his custom to pray 3 times a day, kneeling at his open window toward Jerusalem, giving thanks to God, as he had always done. And when his enemies, jealous of his position, contrived to have prayer to anyone but the king, outlawed on pain of death, Daniel did not alter his practice in the slightest. He went to his house, and his windows being open toward Jerusalem, he kneeled upon his knees 3 times a day, and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as he did aforetime. The threat of death did not change his practice, because his practice was not a negotiable add-on to his life, but the very foundation of it, the source of the strength and wisdom and integrity that had carried him through a lifetime of exile. And when he was thrown into the den of lions for his refusal to stop praying, the God to whom he had prayed so faithfully shut the mouths of the lions, and Daniel emerged unharmed. Daniel teaches us the power and the stability of a sustained life of prayer, maintained faithfully through every adversity, and the way such a life becomes the unshakable foundation on which everything else stands. Consider next the figure of David, whose relationship with prayer was more turbulent, more human, more like our own. David knew the heights of communion with God, The Psalms are full of his prayers and praises, his intimate conversations with the God he loved, his outpourings of joy and longing and trust. But David also knew the depths of falling, the seasons of wandering, the times when his communion with God lapsed and he drifted into grievous sin. After his great fall, his sin with Bathsheba and the murder of her husband, David endured a season of silence, a season of distance from God, a season in which, as he later described it, his bones waxed old through his roaring all the day long, in which God's hand was heavy upon him, in which the joy of his salvation had drained away. And from the depths of that season, David prayed the great prayer of return, Psalm 51, crying out for mercy, for cleansing, for a clean heart and a right spirit, for the restoration of the joy he had lost. And God heard him and restored him, and David, the man who had fallen so grievously, became again the man after God's own heart, his communion restored, his joy renewed, his relationship with God deeper in some ways, for having been broken and healed. David teaches us that even the most grievous falling, even the deepest season of silence, is not beyond the reach of restoration, that the prayer of return is heard even from the depths, that the God who restored David will restore us. Consider the figure of Jonah, the prophet who fled from God, who ran in the opposite direction from where God had called him, who descended into the depths of the sea in the belly of a great fish. Jonah's is a story of a soul that ran from God, that abandoned its calling, that drifted dramatically and deliberately, far from the communion it was meant to maintain. And yet, from the very belly of the fish, from the lowest and darkest place imaginable, Jonah prayed. I cried by reason of mine affliction unto the Lord, and he heard me. Out of the belly of hell cried I, and thou heardest my voice. Out of the belly of hell. There is no place so low, no darkness so deep, no situation so desperate, that the prayer of the returning soul cannot reach God from it. Jonah, in the belly of the fish, having fled as far from God as he could flee, prayed and was heard and was delivered and was restored to his calling. Jonah teaches us that no matter how far we have fled, no matter how low we have sunk, no matter how dark the place we find ourselves in, the prayer of return can reach God from there, and God will hear it and answer it and deliver us and restore us. Consider above all the figure of Jesus himself, whose life of prayer is the model and the source of all our praying. Again and again the Gospels show us Jesus at prayer, rising before dawn to pray, withdrawing to solitary places to pray, spending whole nights in prayer, praying before every major decision and at every major moment of his ministry. The Son of God, who was himself in perfect communion with the Father, nonetheless maintained a constant, sustained, intimate life of prayer, drawing continually on the relationship that was the source of his whole life and work. And in the Garden of Gethsemane, in the hour of his greatest agony, he prayed with an intensity that we can scarcely imagine, sweating as it were great drops of blood, pouring out his soul to the Father, submitting his will to the Father's will, drawing from that prayer the strength to walk into the suffering that lay ahead. The prayer of Gethsemane was the source of the strength of Calvary. The communion in the garden was what sustained him through the cross. Jesus teaches us that prayer is not optional, not peripheral, not a luxury for the spiritually advanced, but the very source of strength for the hardest things we will ever face, the communion from which all our endurance and faithfulness flows. And consider finally that this same Jesus who prayed so faithfully on earth is praying for us still. The scriptures tell us that he ever lives to make intercession for us, that he is at the right hand of God, interceding on our behalf, praying for us with a perfect prayer that never fails. Even in our prayerless seasons, even when we had stopped praying for ourselves, he had not stopped praying for us. The intercession of Christ continued through all our silence, a constant, faithful, perfect prayer offered on our behalf by the one who loves us and gave himself for us. We were never, even in our deepest prayerlessness, without prayer being offered for us, because the great high priest was interceding for us the whole time, holding us before the Father even when we had forgotten to come before him ourselves. This is perhaps the most comforting truth of all for the returning soul, that even your prayerlessness was covered by his prayer, that even your silence was filled by his intercession, that you were being prayed for faithfully and perfectly. Throughout the whole time you were not praying, and his intercession is the foundation of your return. You return to a God before whom you are already being represented by a perfect advocate, already being held in the prayers of the Son who loves you. The witnesses teach us much, but the greatest witness of all is the one who prayed for us when we could not pray for ourselves, and who is praying for us still. Part 18. A word to the one who has been silent the longest. I want to pause here in this part of the study and speak very directly, not to the general audience of everyone who might be watching, but to the specific person who needs this most. You know who you are. You are the one who has been silent the longest. You are the one for whom the prayerless season is not measured in days or weeks, but in years, perhaps in decades. You are the one who has read or listened to everything in this study with a particular ache, because every word of it has described your own experience, the slow drift, the fading nearness, the rising anxiety, the hardening heart, the grey famine, the eroding identity, the quiet loneliness. All of it, your own story, lived out over a long stretch of years in which the conversation with God simply stopped and never started again. I am speaking to you now. I want you to hear, first of all, that you are not too far gone. Whatever distance you have traveled, however long you have been silent, however cold and hard and distant you feel, you are not beyond the reach of return. There is no expiration date on the invitation to come home. There is no point of no return in the spiritual life, no distance so great that the way back is closed, no silence so long that it cannot be broken. The prodigal had wasted everything, had sunk as low as he could sink, had been gone long enough to lose everything he had been given. And still, when he turned toward home, the Father ran to meet him. The length of your absence does not diminish the warmth of the welcome. If anything, it increases it, for there is more joy in heaven over the one who returns from the far country than over the 99 who never wandered so far. You are not too far gone. You have never been too far gone. The distance you fear has placed you beyond hope, has placed you instead exactly where the grace of God most loves to work. I want you to hear, second, that the long silence has not changed how God feels about you. You may imagine that the years of your prayerlessness have accumulated into a barrier, a wall of accumulated neglect that now stands between you and God. That the sheer length of your absence has cooled his love or exhausted his patience or worn out his welcome. It has not. We have seen throughout this study that God's love is not a response to our performance, but an expression of his unchanging nature, and that this means his love for you has not diminished by a single degree across all the silent years. He has loved you through every one of them. He has watched the road through every one of them. He has kept you and pursued you and prepared your return through every one of them. And he feels toward you right now, in this moment, exactly what the father in the parable felt as he saw his son appear on the horizon. Not anger, not coldness, not a grudging willingness to take you back, but an overwhelming, running, embracing, restoring joy at the prospect of your return. The long silence has not changed his heart toward you. It is the same heart it has always been, and it is full of love for you. I want you to hear, third, that the way back is shorter than you think. You may imagine that returning after such a long absence will be an arduous journey, a long and difficult climb back to where you once were, a lengthy process of rebuilding everything that was lost. And it is true that the full restoration of all that was lost will take time. that the felt nearness and the peace and the joy and the rest will be restored gradually as the communion is rebuilt. But the return itself, the turning back, the first step toward home, is not far at all. It is, in fact, as close as a single breath, a single prayer, a single turning of the heart toward God in this very moment. You do not have to journey a long way to begin to return. You have only to turn, here, now, where you are. The far country is not far from the Father's house in the way that matters. The moment the son turned toward home, he was already in the embrace of the Father's love, already the object of the Father's running joy, already as good as home. The distance was traversed not by the son's long journey, but by the Father's eager run. And so it is for you. The moment you turn, he runs. The way back is as short as the turning, and the turning can happen right now. So let me invite you gently and directly to turn right now. Not later, not when you feel more ready, not when you have somehow prepared yourself or cleaned yourself up or worked up sufficient feeling or faith. Right now, exactly as you are, in whatever condition your soul is in, with all the rust and distance and coldness of the long, silent years still on you. Turn your heart, even slightly, even haltingly, toward the God who has been waiting for you all this time. You do not need words, though you may use them if you wish. You need only the turning, the directing of your heart toward him, the first small motion of return. Say, if you can find the words, God, I have been gone a long time. I want to come home. Or simply turn wordlessly in the silence of your heart toward the one who is nearer than your own breath, and know, as you turn, that he sees you, that he has seen you while you were yet a great way off, that he is already running to meet you, that the long silence is over the moment you turn, that you are welcome, that you are loved, that you are home. You are the one who has been silent the longest. And you are, for that very reason, the one whose return will bring the greatest joy in heaven. Come home. He is waiting. He has been waiting all along. Part 19. The promises to hold on to, anchors for the returning soul. As the soul takes up again the journey of prayer, as it returns from the long silence and begins to rebuild the communion it had lost, it needs something to hold on to, something solid and unchanging to anchor itself to through the inevitable ups and downs of the journey home. And God, in his kindness, has given us exactly this, a great treasury of promises, declarations of his unchanging faithfulness, that the returning soul can hold on to, can rehearse, can rest its whole weight upon through every season of the journey. Let us gather a few of these promises now as anchors for the returning soul, truths to cling to when the way is difficult and the feelings are absent and the doubts are loud. Hold on to this promise. Draw nigh to God, and he will draw nigh to you. This is the promise that governs the entire dynamic of return. It is a promise of response, of reciprocity, of a God who meets the soul that moves toward him. You do not draw near to a God who stands at a distance, indifferent to your approach. You draw near to a God who is drawing near to you in the very same moment, who responds to every movement of the soul toward him with a movement of his own toward the soul. The drawing near is mutual. The moment you take a step toward him, he takes a step toward you. The moment you turn toward home, he begins to run toward you. Hold on to this promise when the return feels one-sided, when you wonder whether anyone is on the other end of your halting prayers. Someone is on the other end, and he is drawing near to you exactly as you draw near to him. Hold on to this promise. If we confess our sins, he is faithful and just to forgive us our sins and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. This is the promise that addresses the guilt and the failure that the returning soul so often carries. The accumulated weight of all that went wrong in the silent years. The promise is unconditional in its scope and absolute in its certainty. If we confess, he is faithful and just to forgive, not reluctant to forgive, not grudging in his forgiveness, not partial in his cleansing, faithful and just to forgive all, to cleanse from all unrighteousness, to wipe the slate completely clean. Hold on to this promise when the weight of your failures presses down on you, when the memory of the silent years accuses you, when you wonder whether you can really be forgiven for so long an absence. You can. The promise is sure. Confess, and he forgives, faithfully, completely, finally. Hold on to this promise. I will never leave thee, nor forsake thee. This is the promise that addresses the loneliness and the fear of abandonment that the returning soul so often feels. The worry that God might leave again, that the restored communion might be lost again, that the soul might find itself once more abandoned and alone. But the promise is absolute. Never. Never will he leave you. Never will he forsake you. Whatever happens, however you stumble, however many times you drift, he will not abandon you, will not give up on you, will not let you go. Hold on to this promise when the fear of abandonment rises, when you worry that God might tire of you, that he might finally have had enough. He will never leave you. He has said so, and his word does not fail. Hold on to this promise, being confident of this very thing, that he which hath begun a good work in you will perform it until the day of Jesus Christ. This is the promise that addresses the fear of failure in the journey of return, the worry that you might not be able to sustain the renewed communion, that you might drift again and fail again and never finally make it home. The promise places the responsibility for the completion of the work not on your shoulders, but on God's. He who began the good work will complete it. The God who began drawing you back, who started the work of return in you, will be faithful to carry it on to completion. Hold on to this promise when you doubt your ability to sustain the journey, when you fear your own weakness and inconstancy. You are not sustaining the journey by your own strength. The God who began the work will complete it. Lean your whole weight on that. Hold on to this promise. They that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings as eagles. They shall run and not be weary, and they shall walk and not faint. This is the promise that addresses the weariness and the depletion that the returning soul so often brings, the exhaustion of the years of carrying everything alone, the depletion of resources that prayerlessness produced. The promise is one of renewal, of restored strength, of a recovery of vitality and energy, and endurance for the soul that waits upon the Lord. Hold on to this promise when you feel too tired to go on, too depleted to sustain the journey, too weary even to pray. The waiting itself renews the strength. The very act of turning toward God, of waiting on him, of resting in him, is what restores the strength you lack. You do not need to summon strength to come to him. You come to him to receive the strength you do not have. And hold on to this promise, the greatest of them all. I am persuaded that neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor principalities, nor powers, nor things present, nor things to come, nor height, nor depth, nor any other creature shall be able to separate us from the love of God, which is in Christ Jesus our Lord. This is the promise that holds all the others together, the bedrock beneath every other anchor, the final and absolute assurance that nothing in all of creation, nothing in heaven or earth, nothing in the present or the future, nothing you have done or could ever do, not even your own long silence and prayerless wandering, can separate you from the love of God in Christ Jesus. The love that you return to is the love that will never let you go. The communion that you are rebuilding rests on a love that is unbreakable, unshakable, eternal. Hold on to this promise above all the others, when everything else is shaking, when the doubts are loudest, when the way is darkest. Nothing can separate you from the love of God. Nothing ever could. Nothing ever will. You are held by a love that is stronger than death, more enduring than the mountains, more certain than the rising of the sun. And that love is yours, was always yours, will always be yours, through every season of the long journey home. Part 20. The life that becomes possible. A vision of the restored soul. We have traced the whole arc of this journey. The drift away, the consequences in the silence, the waiting God, the first steps back, the restoration of all that was lost, the sustaining of the renewed life, the witnesses who light the way, the promises that anchor the soul. And now, as we draw toward the close, I want to lift our eyes to a vision of what becomes possible, to paint, as clearly as I can, a picture of the life that awaits the soul, that returns to prayer, and sustains the communion it recovers. For this is not merely a study about avoiding the harms of prayerlessness. It is a study about gaining the riches of a praying life. And those riches are worth fixing our eyes upon, that we might be drawn forward by the vision of what we are returning to. Imagine a soul that has fully recovered its breathing, that lives once again in the continuous, easy communion with God that it was designed for. This is a soul at rest, not because its circumstances are easy. Its circumstances may be as hard as anyone's, but because it has learned to cast its cares, moment by moment, upon the one who cares for it, so that the weight that crushes others does not crush it, because it is not carrying that weight alone. This is a soul that walks through the same difficult world as everyone else, but walks through it accompanied, never alone, always aware of the presence of the one who walks beside it, so that even its hardest hours are not lonely hours, even its darkest valleys are not solitary valleys, for it knows with a settled and unshakable knowledge that it is never alone. Imagine a soul whose peace stands guard over its heart and mind, a garrison that does not abandon its post, so that the anxieties that flood the prayerless life find no entry, or finding entry, are quickly cast out, brought immediately to God, released into His hands, so that they do not accumulate, do not circulate endlessly, do not build into the bottomless free fall of a prayerless anxiety. This is a soul that knows the peace that passes understanding, the peace that cannot be accounted for by circumstances, the peace that makes others wonder, that makes them ask what it has that they lack, that becomes itself a testimony to the God who gives it. This is a soul at peace in a world of turmoil, a still point in a spinning world, an anchor that holds when everything around it is being tossed. Imagine a soul whose joy has been fully restored, that lives in the fullness of joy that is found in God's presence, so that the grayness has lifted entirely and the color has returned to everything, so that ordinary moments glow with a quiet beauty, so that even in difficulty there is an underlying joy that difficulty cannot reach. This is a soul that has stopped its desperate searching for substitutes because it has found the real thing, that has stopped trying to fill the God-shaped emptiness with everything except God, because the emptiness is being filled, at last and continually, by the only one who can fill it. This is a soul that has discovered what life was meant to taste like, that has recovered the savor, that delights in God and in the gifts of God with a delight that no circumstance can steal. Imagine a soul whose heart has been fully softened, that has recovered all the tenderness it had lost, so that it is moved again by beauty and by suffering and by the things of God, so that it loves freely and forgives readily and responds to others with a warmth and a compassion that flow from the love of God that fills it. This is a soul whose conscience is alive and sensitive, quick to perceive and quick to repent, so that it does not drift into the slow hardening that overtakes the prayerless, but stays soft, stays responsive, stays tender, kept that way by the daily softening work of communion with God. This is a soul that has become, year by year, not colder and harder but warmer and softer, growing more loving and more compassionate as it grows older, becoming more like the one whose love is reshaping it. Imagine a soul that hears the voice of its shepherd, that has recovered its spiritual hearing, so that it is guided through the decisions of life by a wisdom beyond its own, so that it perceives the gentle leading of God in the ordinary moments, so that it is never finally lost, never finally without direction, because it can hear the voice that says, "This is the way, walk ye in it." This is a soul that lives in conversation with God, that brings its decisions to Him and receives His guidance, that knows the comfort of His word spoken into its lonely hours and the correction of His word spoken into its wandering, that lives in the rich, two-way communion of a relationship that is alive and active and real. Imagine a soul that is fully anchored in its true identity, that knows, with a settled and unshakable knowledge, that it is a beloved child of God, that its worth is bestowed and not earned, that it is fully known and fully loved. This is a soul that has stopped the exhausting performance, that no longer scrambles to prove itself, that is free from the tyranny of others' opinions, because it already has the only approval that matters. This is a soul at rest in its identity, secure in its belonging, free to live and love and serve out of the overflow of a love it has received, rather than out of the desperate striving to earn a love it fears it lacks. This is a soul that knows whose it is, and therefore knows what it is for, and therefore lives with purpose and meaning and direction, no longer adrift, no longer wondering what its life is for, but anchored and aimed and alive. This is the life that becomes possible. This is what the soul returns to when it returns to prayer. Not a burdensome religious duty, not a tedious obligation, not a grim discipline endured for the sake of avoiding worse consequences, but a life of communion, of peace, of joy, of tenderness, of guidance, of secure identity, of rich and living relationship with the God who made us for Himself. This is the pearl of great price, the treasure hidden in the field, worth more than everything else, and it is available to every soul that will return to the communion it was designed for. The breathing can be resumed, the relationship can be restored. The life that became impossible in the silence becomes possible again in the return. And it is waiting for you, this life, on the other side of a single turning of your heart toward the God who is, even now, watching the road and beginning to run. Part 21, The Soul That Walks with God. A final synthesis. Let us draw together now the threads of everything we have explored, that the whole picture might stand clearly before us as we move toward the close of this study. We began with a question. What happens to your soul when you stop praying? And we have traced the answer through its many dimensions, naming, with as much honesty as we could, the truth that nobody tells you. We saw that prayer is not a religious technique or a mechanism for getting things, but the very breathing of the soul, the continuous communion with God for which the soul was designed, and that its cessation is therefore not the dropping of an optional habit, but the stopping of the breathing the soul cannot live without. We saw that the first thing to fade when prayer stops is the felt nearness of God, not because God withdraws, but because the soul's perception of Him atrophies through disuse, and that this first loss is almost entirely silent, the first domino in a long chain of consequences. We saw that anxiety rushes in to fill the space where prayer used to be, because the cares that prayer was meant to cast upon God now accumulate uncast, circulating endlessly in a closed loop of worry, while the garrison of peace that stood guard over the heart is withdrawn. We saw that the heart slowly hardens, losing its tenderness and sensitivity as the regular softening work of communion ceases and the natural drift toward calcification proceeds unchecked. We saw that the soul loses its spiritual hearing, its ability to discern the voice of God, as the relationship that tuned that hearing is neglected and the instrument goes out of adjustment. We saw the famine of joy, the draining of color and savor from a life cut off from the source of all joy. We saw the erosion of identity, the forgetting of who and whose we are, as the continual reinforcement of our true identity in communion with God ceases. We saw the weakening of resistance, the increased vulnerability to temptation and falling, as the strengthening that prayer provides is cut off. We saw the shrinking of vision, the loss of the eternal perspective as the soul's gaze drops to the immediate and stays there. We saw the quiet loneliness, the relational cost of losing communion with the one presence the soul was most deeply designed to know. And we saw the drift into self-reliance, the subtle pride of a soul that has forgotten its need for God. But we did not stop there, for the truth that nobody tells you is not only a truth about loss. We saw what God was doing in the silence, keeping us, pursuing us, preparing our return, loving us the whole time with a love that our silence could not diminish. We saw how the return actually begins, not with a grand resolution, but with a single turning, one prayer, the first step toward home that sets off rejoicing in heaven. We cleared away the misunderstandings that keep souls from returning, the false ideas that prayer must be performed perfectly, or felt intensely, or given large amounts of time, or earned through worthiness, and saw that the way back is far simpler than the soul tends to fear. We saw what returns when prayer returns, the nearness, the peace, the joy, the tenderness, the hearing, the identity, and above all the relationship from which all of these flow. We considered how the restored life is sustained through the partnership of discipline and delight, through regular rhythms, through the fuel of Scripture, through honesty, through community. We learned from the witnesses, Daniel and his unbroken faithfulness, David and his fall and restoration, Jonah and his prayer from the depths, and above all, Jesus, who prayed for us when we could not pray for ourselves and who intercedes for us still. We spoke directly to the one who has been silent the longest, and we gathered the great promises that anchor the returning soul. And we lifted our eyes to a vision of the life that becomes possible, the rich and living communion that awaits every soul that returns. What is the heart of it all? What is the single truth that gathers all these truths together? It is this: the human soul was made to walk with God. From the very beginning, in the garden, before sin entered and broke the communion, the picture we are given is of God walking with his people in the cool of the day, in unbroken fellowship, in the continuous communion for which they were made. That is the original design, the intended condition, the home from which we have wandered and to which we are invited to return. And the whole of the spiritual life, in a sense, is the recovery of that walk, the restoration of the communion that was broken, the return to the unbroken fellowship for which we were made. Enoch, we are told, walked with God and was not, for God took him, a man so completely in communion with God that the boundary between this life and the next was barely noticeable, who simply walked with God right through the door of death into the fuller presence on the other side. Noah walked with God in the midst of a corrupt generation. Abraham walked before God and was called the friend of God. This is the language of the spiritual life at its truest, walking with God, in communion, in fellowship, in the continuous companionship for which the soul was designed, and prayer is the walking. Prayer is not an interruption of the walk to file a request. Prayer is the walk itself, the continuous communion, the ongoing conversation, the moment-by-moment companionship of a soul that lives in fellowship with God. To pray without ceasing is simply to walk with God, to live in continuous awareness of His presence, to maintain the unbroken fellowship for which we were made. And to stop praying is to stop walking with God, to break the fellowship, to wander away from the companionship into the lonely, far country of a self-directed life. The whole of this study, then, comes down to this single image, a soul that has stopped walking with God, and the invitation to take up the walk again, to fall back into step beside the one who has been walking beside you all along, who slowed his pace to match yours, who never walked on ahead and left you behind, who has been waiting all this time for you to notice him there beside you and to fall back into the rhythm of the walk. That is the invitation. That is what this entire study has been building toward. Not merely the avoidance of harm, not merely the recovery of lost benefits, but the restoration of the walk. The return to the continuous, intimate, joyful companionship with God for which your soul was made, and which is available to you right now. The moment you turn your heart toward the one who has been walking beside you all along, fall back into step, take up the walk again, and discover that the one you thought you had to search for has been right beside you the whole time, matching his pace to yours, waiting only for you to turn and see him there and to walk on with him together all the way home. Closing. A final word and a blessing. We have walked a long way together in this study, and my heart is full of gratitude for the chance to explore these truths with you, full of wonder at the patience and the love of the God who waits for every wandering soul, full of hope for you, for the specific person who has stayed with this study through every part of it, who has perhaps recognized your own story in what we have explored, and who is perhaps even now beginning to feel something stir, a longing, a turning, the first faint motion of return. If something in this study has been a word for you, if a truth or a phrase or a moment has landed somewhere deep and begun to do its quiet work, then I want to ask you to do something with it. Do not let it remain only information that passes through you and is forgotten. Take a single step, pray a single prayer right now before you do anything else. It need not be eloquent. It need not be long. It need only be honest, a single turning of your heart toward the God who has been waiting for you. Say, if you can, Lord, here I am. I want to come home. And then keep turning day by day in the small and sustainable ways we have explored, and let the communion be rebuilt, and let the breathing be resumed, and let your soul come home to the walk with God for which it was made. And if you have been encouraged by this study today, if this channel has been a place where you have found something of value, then I want to ask you sincerely and warmly to do a few things before you go. Please subscribe to this channel if you have not already done so, and turn on the notification bell so that every new study we release comes straight to you and you never miss a single one. Please give this video a like. It takes only a moment, and it genuinely helps more people find this content, more people who may be sitting in the silence right now, wondering if there is a way back, who need to find what you have found today. And please share this video with someone in your life who needs it. You know who that person is. The friend who has drifted from their faith, the family member who has been carrying something heavy and silent for a long time, the person who told you once that they used to pray but somehow stopped. Send it to them. You do not need to add a long explanation. Just send it with a simple word. I thought of you. You never know what these hours in the presence of these truths might do for a heart that has been waiting without even knowing it for exactly this. The content coming to this channel in the days ahead is some of the most meaningful work we have ever prepared. More journeys into the depths of Scripture, more encounters with the God who speaks through it, more studies designed to meet you exactly where you are and to draw you closer to the one who loves you. Stay close, stay subscribed, because the best is always still to come, and we would be honored to have you with us for all of it. And wherever you are in the world right now, whatever city, whatever country, whatever time of day or night, I am so glad you are here. You are part of a community that spans the globe, that reaches across oceans and languages and time zones, drawn together by one love, gathered around one God, seeking one thing, to walk with Him, to know Him, to come home to the communion for which we were all made. You belong here. We are glad you are here, and we will be here every week, walking this road alongside you. Now go. Go in the peace of the one who has been waiting for you all along. Go and take up the walk again, the walk with God for which your soul was made. Go and pray, however haltingly, however small the first prayer may be, knowing that it is received with all the joy of a father welcoming home a child he had longed for every day of the absence. Go knowing that you are loved with a love that your silence could not diminish, kept by a power that never slumbered, pursued by a heart that never gave up, and welcomed home by a God who is, even now, running to meet you. May the God of all peace, who never left you in the silence and never will leave you in the days ahead, draw you back into the communion for which he made you. May the Lord who watches the road run to meet you the moment you turn toward home. May the joy that you lost be restored, the peace that you forgot be recovered, the tenderness that hardened be softened, and the relationship that faded be made new and deeper than before. And may you walk with him all the days of your life in the continuous, intimate, joyful companionship that is the truest home your soul will ever know, until the day when the walk of faith becomes the walk of sight, and you find yourself, at last, fully and forever in the presence of the one you have been walking toward all along. He is here. He has always been here, and he is so very glad that you have come home. Draw nigh to God, and he will draw nigh to you. James 4:8. In thy presence is fullness of joy. At thy right hand there are pleasures forevermore. Psalm 16:11. I will never leave thee, nor forsake thee. Hebrews 13:5.